The Huawei Story, From a Shenzhen Apartment to Global Contender, 1987 to 2003. Huawei's Improbable Forge, From Reseller to Builder, 1987 to 1992. Huawei was not born a technology company. It was forced to become one. Between September 1987 and the spring of 1993, a tiny Shenzhen reseller of imported phone switches transformed itself into a self-developing manufacturer because its Hong Kong supplier decided to cut out the middleman. That cornered pivot, undertaken by a 43-year-old cashiered military engineer with RMB 21,000 of pooled capital, fewer than 24 staff, and no access to state bank credit, is the seed from which the world's largest telecommunications equipment company grew. The story matters because it inverts the usual reading of Huawei as a state-engineered champion. In its formative years, the firm was a marginal private collective that the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications neither managed nor recognized, financed itself through usurious private loans and one of China's earliest employee shareholding schemes, and survived by selling 48-line analog PBXs to county post offices that foreign giants had never bothered to visit. The pivot established the cultural, financial, and strategic genome that Huawei would carry for the next 4 decades: indigenous R&D as existential necessity, rural-encirclement marketing borrowed from Mao, mattress-and-soup work intensity drawn from the PLA Infrastructure Engineering Corps, and a financing model that bound employees to the firm by making them shareholders. The 5 years from 1987 to 1992 were the years in which Huawei learned that it could not buy its future and would have to build it. A demobilized engineer in a frontier city. Ren Zhengfei arrived in Shenzhen in 1983 as a casualty of Deng Xiaoping's military reforms. Born October 25, 1944, in impoverished Zening County, Guizhou, the eldest of 7 children of 2 rural school teachers, he had survived the 1960 Guizhou famine, graduated from the Chongqing Institute of Civil Engineering and Architecture in 1968, and been assigned to the Capital Construction Engineering Corps, or GGN Kongchengbing, a uniformed but technically civilian PLA branch tasked with industrial megaprojects. His defining assignment came in 1974 when his 22nd Detachment was sent to build the Liaoyang Petrochemical Fiber General Factory along the Taizi River in northeast China, using imported equipment from the French firm Technip Spakem. Ren has described the conditions in his own words. Men slept on the grass when they arrived, temperatures dropped to -28°C, and crews lived for 6-month stretches on pickled vegetables and sorghum. He reverse-engineered an air pressure balance instrument needed to test the French controls, won recognition as a PLA delegate to the 1978 National Science Conference, and attended the 12th National Congress of the CCP in 1982. 2 lessons from Liaoyang would resurface relentlessly in his later management writings: that the world's most advanced technology came from somewhere else, and that enduring hardship was a competitive asset. The Engineering Corps was disbanded in 1983 as part of Deng's roughly 1 million troop downsizing, and Ren, a veteran without any rank in his phrasing, moved his family south to Shenzhen, taking a job at the logistics service base of the Shenzhen South Sea Oil Corporation, or Nanyou. He was promoted to deputy general manager of one of Nanyou's electronics subsidiaries, where between 1985 and 1987, he was reportedly defrauded out of more than 2 million RMB in an external transaction, a sum equivalent to nearly 2,000 years of his roughly 100 yuan monthly salary. He lost the job. His first wife, Meng Jun, the daughter of a former Sichuan vice governor and a Nanyou executive in her own right, divorced him. Their daughter, Meng Wanzhou, would keep her mother's surname and decades later become Huawei's CFO. Ren, by then 43, moved into a roughly 10-square-meter rented flat with his elderly parents and several nephews. The financial trauma is widely cited in Chinese biographies, but has never been confirmed in Ren's own Western interviews. It should be read as plausible context rather than verified fact. Either way, the collapse explains the existential paranoia that defined his subsequent management style and the famous later line that only those who live in fear and uncertainty can survive in this fast-changing information society. Shenzhen itself was the second protagonist. Designated China's first special economic zone in 1980, the former fishing village county had become, by 1987, the most commercially permissive place in China. In February 1987, 6 months before Huawei's registration, the Shenzhen government issued the tentative provisions on encouraging technology and science personnel to establish non-state-owned technological enterprises, which lifted controls on private ownership in the high-tech sector. The Shenzhen River separated the SEZ from Hong Kong, providing a porous gateway for imported electronics, foreign exchange, and commercial know-how, all under preferential tax and regulatory treatment. Huawei's founding date, most commonly given as September 15, 1987, though Huawei's own materials and most Western press just say 1987, was therefore not coincidence but coincidence's opposite. The company was a textbook product of 3 policies converging at a single border crossing. A reseller built on someone else's switches. Huawei was registered with RMB 21,000 in capital, equivalent to roughly US dollars 3,400 to 5,000, depending on which 1987 exchange rate is used. Ren contributed only part of the total. According to Huawei-cited sources, 5 other investors each put up RMB 3,500. Mei Zhongxing of Shenzhen Sanjiang Electronics, Zhang Shangyang of the Shenzhen Bureau of Development Planning, accountant Wu Huiqing of Shenzhen Petrochemical, Shen Dingxing of Zhuhai Communications Equipment Manufacturing, and Chen Jinyang of China Travel Service Shenzhen. All 5 would gradually withdraw over the next several years, leaving Ren in effective control. The name Huawei was chosen, by Ren's own retelling, from a slogan he saw painted on a wall, Zhonghua Yiwu, China has promise, and the founding tagline Xinji Zhonghua Yu So Zuwei, hearts tied to China, making a difference, fused nationalist intent with commercial ambition. The company was registered not as a private enterprise, private business licenses were not issued in China until 1992, but as a collectively owned enterprise, GT Soyur G, an ambiguous status that would later feed the long-running scholarly dispute over who actually owns Huawei. The first office was a small rented apartment in Nanshan District, in the Nanyu complex where Ren had recently lost his job. The starting headcount was tiny. Primary Chinese sources, including the historical reconstruction by Cheng Dongsang and Liu Liwa, summarized in the Pekingnology translation, describe roughly 14 employees at registration in 1987, growing to more than 20 by November 1991. The figure of approximately 600 R&D employees by 1990 that has propagated through English-language Wikipedia and many derivative texts is almost certainly a Wikipedia-era error. It is incompatible with the documentation that Huawei still had only some 270 staff at the early 1993 annual meeting in Shenzhen and should be discarded. The actual business was unglamorous arbitrage. Huawei was an agent for a Hong Kong company variously transliterated as Hongnin, Hongyan, or Hongyan Kongxi, importing and reselling that company's small HAX brand program-controlled PBX switches to mainland customers. Ren himself crossed and recrossed the Shenzhen-Hong Kong border, hauling switching gear back to customers desperate for upgraded communications. The earliest customers were precisely the buyers that foreign vendors ignored: hotels, factories, mining operations, small enterprises, and the post and telecom bureaus of small towns and rural counties. The business model was lean. Tian Tao and Wu Chunbo describe it and the Huawei story as a poorly equipped team with neither product nor money that fought through the lines of foreign companies and Chinese state-owned enterprises and found a hope of survival.
A signature early Huawei toast captured the mood. "We shall drink to celebrate our success, but if we should fail, let's fight to our utmost until we all die." Margins were apparently good enough that after Ren persuaded the supplier to extend credit, Huawei reportedly secured RMB 20 million worth of consigned goods on which it could pay only after selling its first pot of gold. 7 countries, 8 systems, 1 underserved hinterland. Huawei's reseller business existed inside a market structure now memorialized in a single Chinese phrase, "Qiguo Baji," "Qiguo Baju," 7 countries, 8 systems. China's switching infrastructure in the late 1980s was a fragmented patchwork of incompatible foreign equipment, the residue of a Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications policy that since 1986 had explicitly authorized direct import, technology absorption through joint ventures, and indigenous innovation in parallel. The 8 systems most commonly listed in Chinese telecom industry sources were Fujitsu's F150 and NEC's NEAX X61, the 2 Japanese systems that pushed the count from 7 to 8, AT&T's 5S from the United States, Ericsson's AXE100 from Sweden, Siemens's EWSD from Germany, Alcatel's E10 from France, Northern Telecom's DMS from Canada, and Belgium BTM's System 12 S1240, which was localized through Shanghai Bell, the dominant joint venture, founded in 1983 and later restructured under Alcatel after Alcatel acquired ITT BTM in 1986. The fragmentation was expensive.
Per-line equipment prices ran above US $500. Residential installation fees in early 1990s mid-sized cities reached RMB 4,000 to 5,000, with 6-month waiting lists, and interconnection across provincial networks was a maintenance nightmare, requiring foreign technicians and foreign exchange spending. Telephone penetration was strikingly low, variously estimated at 6 to 7 million fixed lines in a country of 1.1 billion at the start of the 1990s, less than 1 phone per 100 people. Eva Dao's House of Huawei records that Shanghai Bell's S1240 line had trucks queuing outside its Shanghai factory waiting for switches, and the JV played a foundational role, bringing in core technology but perhaps even more importantly, training a generation of Chinese scientists and engineers. That generation included the team at the PLA Information Engineering University in Zhengzhou, where computer scientist Wu Zhengxing accepted the assignment in 1985 to build a domestic switch, and after locking himself in a room for 7 days and nights, concluded that he should design a computer that can make phone calls. Wu's team launched China's first 10,000-line domestically developed digital program-controlled switch, the HJD04, nicknamed the Chinese Pride Switch, in 1991, and a state-owned commercialization vehicle called Great Dragon, or Zhulong, was created around it. Vice Premier Zhu Rongji praised HJD04 as a fresh breeze, and the company, not Huawei, was originally anointed China's national champion for telecom equipment. The fragmented foreign-dominated upper market and the rising domestic champion middle market left a single category open, the underserved rural and small-town hinterland, where multinationals had little presence, where county post offices had limited budgets, and where local procurement officials enjoyed wide discretion. That gap was Huawei's escape hatch when its arbitrage business collapsed. The pivot nobody intended. The supply crisis arrived sometime in 1989-1990. The most concrete account, repeated in Huawei's own corporate history briefings and in Eva Dao's reporting, is straightforward. Hongnian recognized that it could make more money by entering the mainland market directly and stopped selling to Huawei. The widely circulated version in which Hongnian was acquired or went bankrupt is not supported by the primary record. At the early 1993 Huawei summary meeting in Sheko, Ren personally awarded gold medals to outstanding employees and to the boss of Hongnian, who he publicly thanked for supporting the start of Huawei. The supplier was alive and well. It had simply graduated past needing a distributor. Switch prices were also falling, and competition among Hong Kong mainland intermediaries was intensifying, squeezing reseller margins. Ren had, by some accounts, anticipated the cutoff and begun hiring engineers preemptively.
Either way, the gradual decline in switch prices and the supplier's exit forced him, as the Wikipedia summary of Chinese accounts puts it, to import components made in China and hire people to assemble small user exchanges. The first product, the BH01, appeared in 1989. Despite frequent description in popular accounts as Huawei's first switch, it was not in any rigorous sense Huawei engineered. It was assembled from Chinese-sourced components in a configuration that several Chinese language reconstructions describe as a re-engineered or licensed design. The frequently cited claim that the BH01 was sourced from the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications Research Institute 7 or from Cleveland Electronics could not be definitively corroborated in the published English-language record. Eva Dow's 2025 House of Huawei is the most authoritative recent source for adjudicating this lineage. What is undisputed is that BH01 passed Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications inspection in 1990, putting Huawei across the regulatory threshold from trader to manufacturer. The first truly self-developed Huawei product was the HJD48, a small analog space division or Kangfenshi PBX switch with 48-line capacity, developed under the technical direction of Zheng Baoyong and commercialized in 1991-1992. Zheng, universally known as Bao and assigned the famous Huawei employee number 002, was a 1987 master's graduate of the Huazhong University of Science and Technology, or HUST, recruited away from his HUST PhD program in 1989 by his classmate Gao Ping. The HJD48 was followed by a 100-line variant marketed as the BH03, with which Ren began signing on regional sales agents. Within roughly a year of the HJD48's commercial launch, Huawei's annual revenue crossed the RMB 100 million mark. One Chinese-language account credits HJD48 alone with roughly 300 million RMB in 1993, though precise figures vary by source.
In September 1991, Huawei consolidated its R&D and assembly operations on the third floor of an industrial building in the Oyster Industrial Village of Baoan County. It was here that the mattress and soup origin myth, which is more documented fact than myth, took shape. Tian Tao and Wu Chunbo described the building outfitted with workspaces and a kitchen, beds set against the walls, mattresses placed on the floors, and employees working punishing hours with sleeping and eating on site. Ren, by his employees' contemporaneous recollections, lived and ate in the factory, occasionally cooking soup for his engineers in the evening. The mattress-culture, Chuangdian Wenhua, of rolled-up bedding stowed under desks and in cabinet bottoms became Huawei's signature visible practice and the literal substrate of what was later christened wolf culture. "I'll have no choice but to jump from this building." The famous Ren Zhengfei quote about jumping off the building if R&D failed is widely misplaced in Huawei's chronology. According to the Baidu Baike biography, the line was delivered at Huawei's early 1993 annual meeting, when Ren announced that the company's accumulated profits would be reinvested rather than distributed as bonuses, in a bet to develop a 10,000-line digital program-controlled switch. That switch became the C&C08, the name standing for City and Country 08, Huawei's first true central office digital switch, and the product that, after its 1993 release, would close the gap with Shanghai Bell and break Huawei into the public network market. The C&C08 bet was triggered, in turn, by a costly mistake. In May 1993, Ren had launched the JK1000, a larger analog space division end office switch on which he had bet the company's near-term future. It sold only about 200 units and nearly bankrupted Huawei. The Wikipedia synthesis of Chinese sources is blunt. JK1000 products focus on the use of analog circuit technology rather than digital circuit technology, so that Ren made the mistake of not keeping up with the times.
Once Wu Jiangxing's HJD04 had demonstrated that a domestic 10,000-line digital switch was feasible, Ren ordered Zhang Baoyang's team to skip the analog generation, and a young new recruit, Li Yinan, the HUST boy genius who joined Huawei in 1992, was eventually placed in charge of the C&C08 effort. Zhang's relative seniority in R&D leadership shifted accordingly. The takeaway for the 1988 to 1992 narrative is that the famous existential commitment to R&D was not a single 1990 pivot decision, but a sequence of escalating commitments, first to assembled product, BH01 1989, then to in-house design, HJD48 1991, then to a national-grade central office switch, C&C08 1993. Each step raised both the technical bar and the financial stakes. By the spring of 1993, when Ren made the jump from the building speech, Huawei was already too far in to retreat. The company had roughly 270 employees, was operating from a single industrial floor in Bao'an, and had bet its retained earnings on the digital generation that the foreign incumbents and Shanghai Bell were already shipping. Financing the impossible. Huawei's pre-1994 financing was a study of scarcity. The company was a private collective, locked out of the state bank credit lines available to SOEs. According to multiple accounts later compiled in Eric Harwitz's China Quarterly article in 2007 and the CSIS Huawei case study 2013, Huawei borrowed from non-bank private lenders at annual interest rates of 20 to 30% to keep R&D and operations running. Customer prepayments and supplier credit were used aggressively. But the most consequential financial innovation and one of Huawei's most durable cultural and strategic moats was the introduction in 1990 of an employee stock ownership plan 3 years after founding. The original 1990 design, well documented in academic studies of Huawei's ESOP by Toshio Goto and by Meng and Wu, made roughly 15% of Huawei's stock available to employees at a price of 10 RMB per share, with 15% of after-tax profit distributed as dividends. Ren, by his employees' contemporaneous recollections, described the rationale much later in a December 2011 essay. When I founded the company, I designed the employee stock ownership system to unite employees through benefit sharing.
At that time, I did not understand the option system. Still less did I know that the West was very developed in this area. Only based on my past life setbacks, I realized that I should share the responsibilities and benefits with the employees. Through successive dilutions, Ren's own stake was driven down toward roughly 1%. Figures from 0.81% to 1.42% appear in different sources and years, even as he retained veto rights over major decisions through the trade union committee structure that holds employee shares on aggregate. The 1990 ESOP would do at least 3 things at once: substitute for cash compensation Huawei did not have, lock in talent that could otherwise have walked across the SEZ to ZTE or a multinational JV, and give the firm a financing structure that its private sector competitors could not easily replicate. In November 1991, Huawei applied to convert from its initial corporate form into a collectively owned enterprise, a status approved in June 1992. The change put the firm in safer political territory than a fully private classification and aligned it with the Shenzhen government push to support indigenous high-tech enterprises. There is no credible evidence of any outside equity investor in 1988 to 1993. The first large state bank credit line, RMB 3.9 billion in buyer's credit from China Construction Bank, did not arrive until 1998, well after the period in question. Bruce Gilley's December 2000 Far Eastern Economic Review article, alleging an early USD $8.5 million state bank loan, is treated by CSIS as a single-source claim, and Huawei has consistently denied it. Selling to the counties. The early sales strategy was articulated in a phrase that Ren borrowed without apology from Mao Zedong:
Yi Nongchun Baowei Chengshi, surround the cities from the countryside, while Alcatel, Lucent, Nortel, Ericsson, Siemens, NEC, and Fujitsu staffed thinly in big cities and concentrated on JV channels for high-margin urban contracts, Huawei dispatched salespeople and engineers to county post and telecom bureaus across China. Chang Li's China Leadership Monitor documents the contrast on the ground. In 1992, Ericsson had only 3 or 4 employees working on telecom networks in Heilongjiang province. Huawei had over 200 staff who lived and worked in counties, towns, and small cities throughout the same province. Engineers slept on customer floors during installations and outages. The famous and possibly improved with age anecdote, repeated by Huawei in official campus tours, has Huawei technicians staying overnight at a hotel customer to discover that rats chewing telephone wiring, a finding that prompted Huawei to add mesh rat screens to subsequent enclosures, and alongside surge-resistant power supply modules to handle rural grid instability, became part of the C&C08 product specification. The price advantage was substantial and structural. Huawei consistently undercut foreign equipment by roughly 30 to 50% in the domestic market during the early to mid-1990s. Later international undercutting reportedly reached 70% in some markets. The pricing was sustainable because Huawei's R&D cost base was Chinese, its sales force lived locally, and its products targeted markets where foreign sales channels barely existed. The local bureau alignment was further deepened from the mid-1990s onward through a network of joint ventures with provincial and prefectural telecom administrations, Sichuan Huawei, Shanghai Huawei, Chengdu Huawei, Shenyang Huawei, and Huawei, through which a substantial share of investment flowed back to local PTA partners as dividends. These structures fall slightly outside the strict 1988 to 1992 window, but their logic was already in place. The sales context was a giant. Under the 8th Five-Year Plan, 1991 to 1995, China invested roughly RMB 241.4 billion, USD 29.4 billion in fixed posts and telecommunications assets, 12 times the comparable figure for the 7th plan. Telephone subscribers rose from about 5 million in 1985 to roughly 40 million in 1995. Mobile subscribers, almost zero in 1991, had reached 5 million by mid-1996. Telecom revenue grew at a compound annual rate of 54% during 1991 to 1995, against GDP growth of about 11.7%. The state was effectively pouring concrete and copper at a pace that no foreign supplier alone could meet, and the procurement system, managed by MPT as both regulator and monopoly operator, with provincial PTAs exercising broad discretion, favored vendors who could deliver, install, customize, and maintain equipment in places multinationals never went. Big Four in formation. Huawei was not the only Chinese firm reading this opportunity, and through the early 1990s, it was not even the leading Chinese name.
The grouping, later christened Chuda Zhonghua or Juda Zonghua by Minister of Information Industry Wu Jichuan, combined the first characters of Zhulong, Great Dragon, Da Tong, Zhongxing, ZTE, and Huawei. ZTE, founded in February 1985 in Shenzhen as Zhongxing Semiconductor by Huawei Gui, was Huawei's most direct early competitor. Capitalized at roughly 2.8 RMB with backing from the Ministry of Aerospace Industries Factory 691 and Xi'an Microelectronics, ZTE began with consumer trading, watches, electric organs, telephones, formed an 8-person R&D group in 1986, and in 1989 launched its ZX60 PBX, followed by the ZX500, described by Huawei Gui as China's first domestic PBX without foreign patents.
Like Huawei, ZTE was excluded from major city contracts dominated by Nokia, Motorola, and Ericsson, and pursued provincial and rural markets with a simplified ZX500A. Its decisive structural innovation came in March 1993 when it reorganized as Zhongxing New Telecommunications Equipment Company under a state-owned, privately operated hybrid. 2 SOE shareholders held 5 of 9 board seats, while founder's private vehicle, Zhongxing WXT, held 4. The 1994 ZXJ2000, a 2500-line digital subscriber program-controlled switch, recognized as a national-level new product, gave ZTE a public network credential roughly contemporary with Huawei's C&C08. Great Dragon had been the Great State Hope. Built around Wu Jiangxing's 1991 HJD04 10,000-line digital switch, the firm licensed production to a consortium of 14 state-owned enterprises, including Luoyang Factory 537, Beijing Factory 738, and Hangzhou Factory 522, plus 8 component suppliers. The dispersed structure proved fatal. Internal price wars among Julong licensed factories, software quality problems, and a 1999 PLA divestiture order that forced Wu Jiangxing to resign and return to PLA EIU eventually paralyzed the firm. By the early 2000s, Great Dragon was effectively dead. The lesson Huawei drew, that technology alone, without commercial coherence, was insufficient, would shape its later attitude toward standards consortia, JV structures, and outsourced manufacturing. Da Tong, formally established in 1998, came out of MPT's Telecommunications Science Technology Research Institute, which would later become known for the TD-SC-DMA 3G standard. In 1988 to 1992, it was a research arm rather than a commercial vendor. The foreign incumbents Shanghai Bell, Beijing International Switching Corporation, a Siemens JV established October 1990 to manufacture EWSD, Lucent, Ericsson, Nortel, NEC, Fujitsu, Motorola, and Nokia held urban and trunk network market share and trained Chinese engineers in volume. Hansen et al.'s 2000 research policy paper found that the 6 largest SPC switchmakers in China in 1997 produced about 80% of national output of more than 20 million lines, with Huawei ranked second among the Chinese electronics top 10, BISC third, and Shanghai Bell Telephone Manufacturing fourth. The structure of the Chinese switching market that Huawei would dominate by the late 1990s, domestic vendors at price and service advantage, JVs at brand and reliability advantage, was set during the years studied here. Wolf, Mattress, and Mao. The cultural genome that Huawei would carry forward was forged in this period, even when its terminology was named only later. The earliest documented use of the term wolf culture is in an early 1990s conversation Ren had with a Western consultant, recounted in Tian and Wu's writings and summarized by China Labor Bulletin. If multinationals were elephants, Huawei was a mouse, and a mouse without a wolf spirit, a keen sense of smell, an aggressive offensive instinct, and group cooperation, would be crushed. Ren's articulation of the 3 traits, later reproduced in employee training materials, framed wolves as bloodthirsty, hyperattentive to market signals, resistant to coldness, fearless of difficulty, and pack-acting, team-oriented. The mattress culture preceded the wolf phrase by years. The rolled bedding under desks and the on-site cooking by the founder were photographed and described from the Baoan industrial floor in 1991 to 1992. The military analogy in Ren's leadership rhetoric is real but disputed. The CEIBS case study by Farr and PI describes Ren as integrating military experience into Huawei's culture by emphasizing clear goal setting, discipline, sacrifice, and absolute obedience, while also taking care of the troops through high pay and equity.
Ren himself told CNBC in 2019 that he used military metaphors because they were simple and easy to understand, conceding that some employees had been intimidated by my military-style speeches. Critics, including David Baldinga and Donald Clark, have argued that the militarized reading of Huawei is overplayed in Western media, that many executives use military language without ever serving. But the structural features, mass mobilization, self-criticism, last-place elimination of underperformers, and Maoist countryside encirclement strategy are too consistent across decades to be incidental. Ren's earliest preserved writings, available through Huawei's Xinjiang community and the Huawei People internal newspaper, begin in January 1994 with Notes from a Trip to America, Fu Mei Kao Cha Sanji. Virtually no primary text from the 1988 to 1992 period survives in publicly accessible form, which is itself part of the early Huawei culture. A founder who refused interviews, wrote sparingly, and kept the company off the public stage. Two ideological commitments from this period would lock in Huawei's strategic identity. First, the R&D first investment philosophy, codified in 1998 as the 10% of revenue rule in the Huawei Basic Law, but practiced since at least the early 1990s, produced the unusual ratio of roughly 500 R&D staff to 200 production staff that Pele Fan documented in Technovation. Second, the rejection of the JV technology absorption path taken by Shanghai Bell. As Fan and others have quoted Ren, the goal was to develop the national industry, not to set up joint ventures with foreign companies, insist on self-development. That choice was politically awkward. JV vendors had MPT's institutional embrace, while Huawei was governed by what Chinese commentators have called the three don'ts policy of MPT toward collective enterprises. Don't manage, don't recognize, don't take responsibility. It was also financially punishing, but it would prove, by the late 1990s, to have been the only path to a firm that could compete at the global frontier rather than absorbing technology one generation behind it. What the period actually delivered. Stripped of legend, the hard outputs of Huawei's 1987 to 1992 phase are modest and specific. The company moved from 0 employees and 0 revenue to roughly 270 staff and approximately RMB 100 million in 1992 revenue, with sales rising further toward the RMB 300 to 400 million range in 1993 on the back of the HJD48 and the early C&C08. It transitioned across 3 product generations: resold HJAX, assembled BH01, and self-developed HJD48 and BH03, and laid the engineering and managerial foundation for the digital C&C08 that would carry it into the rest of the decade. It built an employee shareholding system that financed both growth and retention, cultivated a recruiting pipeline at HUST. Zhang Baoyang, Li Yinan, and many others would come from that single university, pioneered a rural-encirclement strategy that no foreign competitor would seriously contest until the early 2000s, and developed the mattress-culture work intensity that became Huawei's signature operating mode. What it did not yet deliver is also worth flagging. There was no significant export business, no urban network presence in Shanghai or Beijing, no relationship with the Chinese state security apparatus, and no foreign subsidiary infrastructure. The PLA National Telecom Network contract, that critics frequently cite as a state favoritism milestone, dates to 1994, after Ren's reported meeting with Jiang Zemin, in which Ren is said, though not confirmed by him, to have argued that a country without its own program-controlled switches is like one without an army.
The Buy Local campaign that named Huawei as one of 5 domestic switch champions came in 1996, and the China Construction Bank Buyer's Credit Program came in 1998. Each of these later milestones is downstream of the 1987 to 1992 foundation. None of them caused it. Conclusion: a forced foundation. The conventional interpretation of Huawei as a state project understates how marginal and improvised the company was during its formative years, while the conventional entrepreneurial genius interpretation overstates how clearly Ren saw the future. The truer reading is that Huawei became a technology company because its trading model collapsed, and that everything else, from the wolf culture to the rural-encirclement strategy to the employee shareholding scheme, was a successive set of forced choices made under capital, talent, and supply constraints that left no room for elegant alternatives. The 1988 to 1992 period is the period in which those forced choices hardened into doctrine: indigenous R&D as existential survival, employee equity as cash substitute, hardship as competitive moat, and the underserved Chinese hinterland as the strategic launchpad from which the urban and global markets would eventually be reached.
By the time the C&C08 hit the field in 1993 and the JK1000 fiasco was past, Huawei had become a different kind of entity. Not yet a global player, but no longer a reseller of someone else's switches, and committed to a technology and talent-intensive growth path that very few of its peers would survive. The Hong Kong decision to cut Huawei off was, in retrospect, the most consequential strategic gift the firm ever received. 2 final caveats deserve to be stated plainly. First, the figure of approximately 600 R&D employees by 1990 that has propagated through English-language summaries should be discarded. The primary Chinese language record places Huawei at roughly 14 staff in 1987, more than 20 in 1991, and about 270 by early 1993. Second, Ren Zhangfei's "I'll jump from the building" quote belongs to the early 1993 C&C08 commitment, not to the 1990 pivot from reseller to manufacturer, and conflating the two flattens what was actually a layered, multi-year escalation of commitment. The story is dramatic enough at its proper scale. It does not require enlargement. The C&C08 Era, How Huawei Bet Everything and Won, 1993 to 1996. By the first weeks of 1993, Huawei Technologies was a company balanced on the edge of a knife. It had roughly 270 employees, occupied a single industrial floor in Bao'an County on the outskirts of Shenzhen, and had just crossed the RMB 100 million revenue mark for the first time, a milestone that Ren Zhangfei celebrated at the annual summary meeting in a small auditorium in Sheko by declaring, with visible relief, "We survived." He awarded 100 gold medals to outstanding employees that day, and even invited the boss of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong company that had once supplied Huawei's resold PBX switches and then cut it off, thanking him publicly for supporting Huawei's start. But the celebration was brief. At that same meeting, Ren made an announcement that stunned the room. The company's retained earnings would not be distributed as bonuses. Every yuan of profit would be reinvested into developing a large-scale digital program-controlled telephone switch, a product category that Huawei had never built, in a technology generation it had never mastered, against competitors backed by billions in state funding and decades of foreign R&D. If the bet failed, there would be nothing left. The scale of the gamble became concrete at a separate mobilization meeting held shortly afterward on the 5th floor of the company's building. Ren Zhangfei stood by the window and addressed his assembled cadres with a calmness that belied the content of his words. He told them that if the R&D effort failed, he would have no choice but to jump from that building.
They could all find new jobs, but for him there would be no second act. Li Yinan, the young prodigy who had just joined from Huazhong University of Science and Technology, described the moment in starker strategic terms. This was a final gamble using the company's entire assets as the stake. The jump from the building line has since become one of the most famous sentences in Chinese corporate history, repeated in dozens of biographies and business school cases. Its precise context, whether delivered from the podium or muttered privately, whether at the Sheko Auditorium or the fifth-floor office, varies between accounts. But the substance is undisputed. In 1993, Huawei committed everything it had to a product called the C&C08, and the next 4 years would determine whether that commitment was genius or suicide. To understand why Ren felt he had no choice, you have to understand the product that had just nearly destroyed the company. In late 1992 and early 1993, Huawei had bet heavily on the JK1000, a Space Division program-controlled end-office switch designed for small towns and rural telephone networks. The JK1000 used analog circuit technology, an architecture that by the time it passed the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications Network Access Certification in May 1993 was already being overtaken by the digital switching revolution. Ren had convened all of Huawei's salespeople for a major mobilization push, rolling out an aggressive sales plan. The results were catastrophic. Only about 200 units were sold. No customers wanted to invest in a platform that was visibly headed for obsolescence, not when Wu Zhangxing's HJD04 digital switch had already proven that Chinese engineers could build a 10,000-line digital system, and not when Shanghai Bell's Alcatel-derived S1240 was the gold standard in every major Chinese city. The losses from the JK1000 reportedly exceeded RMB 60 to 100 million, essentially wiping out the profits that Huawei had accumulated from its earlier HJD48 small PBX business. Employees went on half pay, with the remainder recorded as IOUs convertible into Huawei shares. Ren was forced to borrow from other enterprises at usurious interest rates of 20 to 30%.
The JK1000 was the mistake of a man who had been too slow to read the technology curve, and Ren knew it. The only way forward was to leapfrog into the digital generation, not incrementally, but all at once. The product that would carry that leap was the C&C08, and even its name was a statement of intent. The C&C prefix carried at least 3 layers of meaning: country and city, encoding Mao Zedong's revolutionary doctrine of encircling the cities from the countryside; computer and communication, signaling the digital architecture; and China and communication, wrapping the whole thing in nationalist ambition. The choice to imitate AT&T's naming conventions was deliberate. Huawei wanted to sound like a global player, even when it was a provincial one. The 08 was originally proposed as 06, but was changed for auspicious pronunciation and as a conscious one-upmanship of Wu Zhangxing's 04 machine. The name was finalized through dozens of faxes between Shenzhen and Huawei's tiny U.S. representative office. Every detail mattered, because every detail was a signal. The development of the C&C08 was organized under Zhang Baoyang, Huawei's chief engineer and the man universally known inside the company as Bao. Zhang held employee number 002, the first employee after Ren himself, and had led the development of every significant Huawei product to date, from the HJD48 PBX through the ill-fated JK1000. Born in Fujian Province in 1964, he had earned his master's degree at Huazhong University of Science and Technology in 1987 and been recruited to Huawei in 1989 by his classmate Guo Ping,
abandoning a PhD program to join what was then a tiny trading company with no products of its own. Zhang's background carried a detail that later scholars would find significant. Before joining Huawei, he had been associated with Wu Jiangsang's HJD-04 project at the PLA Information Engineering Institute's Luoyang 014 base, meaning he carried direct knowledge of China's first successful large-scale digital switch into Huawei's own R&D effort. Whether this constituted technology transfer, competitive intelligence, or simply the normal movement of trained engineers through China's small telecom community is a matter of interpretation. What is not in dispute is that Zhang Baoyong was the indispensable technical leader of the C&C08 program. Working under Zhang was Cao Yian, the overall project lead, and Mao Zhang, known as Mao, who served as the day-to-day project manager of the initial 2000-line version. Mao had joined Huawei in 1991 and would later become famous for a refrain that captured the atmosphere of the development effort. He kept telling his team that if they didn't get the switch deployed soon, the boss was going to kill him. It was a joke, but only barely. And then there was Li Yinan, who arrived at Huawei in June 1993 as a freshly minted master's graduate from HUST's legendary juvenile genius class. He had been admitted at age 15. Li's rise through Huawei was so rapid as to strain credulity in the retelling. Promoted to engineer on his second day, deputy general manager of R&D within 2 weeks, deputy general manager of the Central Research Department within 6 months, and chief engineer and president of the Central Research Department within 2 years. He was made a vice president at 27. While Chinese popular sources have exaggerated Li's personal role in the C&C08's creation, he was a brilliant contributor, not the initial architect. His trajectory illustrates something important about Huawei in 1993. It was a company so desperate for talent and so contemptuous of seniority hierarchies that it would hand significant authority to a 23-year-old if that 23-year-old could deliver. The technical architecture of the C&C08 reflected both ambition and pragmatism. It was built as a modular, distributed system. An administration and communication module handled centralized functions like alarm management, clock synchronization, and billing, while separate switching modules and various remote modules, RSM, RSP, RSD, could be deployed at customer sites and connected back to the central unit over fiber optic or trunk cable. The AMCM provided a 16,000 by 16,000 time-slot interchange capacity, which was an order of magnitude beyond what Huawei had ever attempted. The 10,000-line version, when it arrived, represented an unprecedented capacity for a Chinese-designed switch. But the C&C08's real competitive advantage was not in its peak specifications, it was in its hardening for the brutal conditions of Chinese rural telecommunications. Huawei engineers, drawing on years of experience maintaining switches in county post offices and small-town hotels, designed the C&C08 to operate without air conditioning in ambient temperatures that would crash a Shanghai Bell S1240.
They built in a power supply module that could handle the voltage surges and endemic to rural Chinese electrical grids, where supply might sag to 170 volts against the 220 volt standard that foreign equipment required. And in a detail that became one of Huawei's most told origin stories, they added rodent-proof mesh screens to the tops and bottoms of the switch cabinets after discovering that rats chewing through telephone wiring were a recurring cause of outages in rural installations. Songbao Liang, an engineer at the Yiwu post office who worked closely with the early C&C08, later recalled that other manufacturer switches needed constant temperature environments and failed when the power went out, but Huawei's equipment could function in sheds or even under stairwells. There was, however, a more uncomfortable question about the C&C08's technical lineage. Eva Dow, in her 2025 book House of Huawei, the most authoritative recent English-language account of the company's history, reports that to one Western executive who was able to examine the switch's internals, the C&C08 bore a suspicious resemblance to AT&T's number 5 ESS, the workhorse central office switch of the American telephone network. Dow stops short of a definitive accusation.
The resemblance could reflect legitimate architectural learning. The number 5 ESS's distributed modular design was well documented in publicly available technical literature, and Zhang Baoyang's background at the PLA Information Engineering Institute would have exposed him to detailed study of foreign switching architectures. It could also reflect something less legitimate. The question has never been resolved, and given the destruction of most primary documentation from this period, it probably never will be. What can be said is that the C&C08 was not a simple copy. Its adaptations for Chinese rural conditions, its power supply engineering, and its iterative software improvements over the following years were clearly indigenous work, whatever the original architectural inspiration.
A domestic telecom operator quoted in Tian Tao, David de Kremer, and Wu Chunbo's authorized history put it bluntly. In the early years, Huawei's switches were used mostly by county-level operators, were not very reliable, and often broke down, but Huawei did a very good job providing service. Its people were available around the clock, would accept being scolded by customers, and even by Ren Zhengfei himself, would sincerely apologize, and would get the system up and running again as soon as possible. The formula was simple and brutally effective. Sell cheap, promise everything, show up faster than anyone else when things break, and iterate the product in the field until it works. It was not elegant engineering, it was survival engineering. The C&C08 milestones came in rapid succession once the Yiwu teething problems were passed. In August 1993, Zhang Baoyang had announced the switch at Huawei's Rural Communications Technology and Market Symposium, touting internal fiber optics and intelligent features. By September 1993, the 10,000-line prototype had been successfully developed in the lab. The Yiwu 2,000-line deployment closed out the year. In April 1994, Huawei held a 10,000-line technical briefing in Guangzhou. By August 1994, the 10,000-line C&C08 was cut over at Pizhou, a county-level city in Jiangsu province, the first time the switch had entered what could be called an urban deployment, even if only at the county level. In June 1994, Ren delivered a toast speech to celebrate the 120,000-line production milestone, quoting the Internationale, "There has never been any savior, and if China is to be strong, it must rely on itself." In April 1995, the C&C08 passed the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications official production type approval, with a committee chaired by academician Chen Junliang. By June 1995, the State Science and Technology Commission had approved the C&C08 into the National Spark Program. That same year, the C&C08 won the Guangdong Provincial Science and Technology Progress First Prize and the National Science and Technology Progress Second Prize, with Zhang Baoyang as the credited lead. Output value for the C&C08 alone reached RMB 1.3 billion in 1995. The C&C08's commercial breakthrough was amplified by its alignment with one of the Chinese government's most ambitious rural infrastructure programs. In 1995, Beijing launched the Village-Village Connect initiative, Zun Sun Teng, a program to extend basic telephone service to every administrative village in China. The initiative was a massive injection of procurement demand into precisely the market segment that Huawei had been cultivating for 2 years. While foreign vendors had neither the products hardened for rural conditions nor the sales networks to reach thousands of village-level installations, Huawei had both. The company won RMB 1.3 billion in Village-Village Connect orders in 1995 alone, a figure that, combined with its other rural and county-level sales, made the C&C08 the engine of what was now unmistakably a high-growth technology company rather than a scrappy startup. The symmetry was not accidental. Ren had designed the C&C08 for the countryside, had named it for the countryside, and had built the sales force for the countryside precisely because he understood that the Chinese state's development priorities pointed there. When the state's money followed, Huawei was the vendor best positioned to absorb it.
The Village Village Connect program also revealed something important about the C&C08 as a product concept. The switch was not just a single device, but a platform. Its modular architecture allowed Huawei to offer configurations ranging from small remote subscriber modules serving a village of a few hundred people to large central office installations handling tens of thousands of lines in a county seat, all running the same core software and connected through the same fiber optic backbone. This meant that a provincial PTA that bought a C&C08 for its county seat was incentivized to buy Huawei's remote modules for the surrounding villages, creating a lock-in effect that deepened with every deployment. As one Chinese technology commentator later observed, the C&C08 was not just a single product success. More importantly, it provided a product platform from which all of Huawei's later products, including transmission, mobile, intelligent networking, and data communications, were eventually developed. The platform strategy, born of engineering pragmatism rather than deliberate architectural foresight, would prove to be one of Huawei's most enduring competitive advantages. The product's success was inseparable from the market strategy that carried it. Ren Zhengfei's approach to selling the C&C08 was borrowed without apology or subtlety from Mao Zedong's revolutionary playbook, "Encircle the cities from the countryside." The C&C08's very name encoded the doctrine. While Alcatel, Shanghai Bell, Ericsson, Siemens, NEC, Fujitsu, and the other foreign incumbents concentrated their sales forces in China's major cities, where per-line prices were highest, where prestige contracts with provincial capital PTAs justified flying in foreign technicians, and where the purchasing process was relatively professional, Huawei dispatched salespeople and engineers to the county and township post and telecom bureaus that the multinationals had never bothered to visit. The contrast was stark. In 1992, Ericsson had only 3 or 4 employees working on telecommunications networking in the entire province of Heilongjiang. Huawei had over 200 staff in the same province, living and working in the counties, towns, and small cities across its vast territory. According to the CSIS case study by Nathaniel Ahrens, Huawei eventually sent teams of engineers to market its products in every one of China's roughly 2,800 counties. By 1995, approximately 80% of Huawei sales came from rural markets. The economics of rural sales were different from urban ones. Per-line prices were lower, but so were customer expectations and competitive intensity. A county PTA director with a limited budget and a 6-month waiting list for Shanghai Bell equipment was receptive to a domestic vendor offering a switch at 30 to 50% below the foreign price, delivered faster, with engineers who would sleep on the customer's floor during installation and who could be reached by phone at 3 in the morning when something broke. Huawei's salespeople operated under conditions that would have been unrecognizable to their counterparts at Ericsson or Alcatel. In northeastern China, where winter temperatures plunged far below zero, Ren himself described a key staffer who was suffering from hepatitis but refused to return to Shenzhen for medical treatment, insisting on fighting on the front line through the ice and snow at his posting near the Russian border. Business dinners followed a protocol of baijiu shots, 120-proof sorghum liquor, in which the salesperson was expected to get drunker than the customer as a show of respect. One executive later wrote of having to excuse himself for a vomit break while entertaining clients. Stomach and liver ailments were common. The wolf culture that Ren preached, keen smell for opportunity, fearless attacking spirit, collective combat, was not a metaphor in the field. It was a job description. The rural-encirclement strategy was reinforced by a financial and political innovation that Eva Dow, drawing on internal Huawei documents, identifies as perhaps the company's most consequential structural move of the early 1990s. In May 1993, Huawei established a joint venture company called Shenzhen Mobeco Communication Industry Co., Limited. 17 provincial and municipal posts and telecom bureaus invested a combined 39 million yuan into Mobeco. Huawei contributed power supply technology. The structure created an extraordinary alignment of interests. The same public telecom bureaus that had helped finance the development of the CN08 through their investment in Mobeco were now the procurement decision-makers responsible for buying switches for their local telephone exchanges. Not only that, but Huawei outsourced production of the CN08 to Mobeco, meaning the investors were indirectly manufacturing the product they were buying. Dow calls this arrangement Huawei's marriage to the state, and it is difficult to overstate its importance. It gave Huawei a captive distribution channel, political alignment with the provincial telecom establishment, and a financing mechanism that did not depend on state bank loans, which, as a private collective enterprise, Huawei could not easily obtain. The Mobeco model was replicated and extended through a network of regional joint ventures: Shanghai Huawei, Sichuan Huawei, Chengdu Huawei, Shenyang Huawei, Anhui Huawei, and others, most established between 1993 and 1998. The terms were generous to local partners. In the Sichuan Huawei arrangement, for example, local partners could receive 60 to 70% of their investment back annually in the form of dividends. These joint ventures were, as Harwitz's China Quarterly analysis noted, essentially shell companies that functioned as a mechanism to return money to local telecommunications employees in exchange for equipment procurement. The arrangement was controversial, but not banned, and it gave Huawei a depth of local political embedding that no foreign vendor and few domestic competitors could replicate. Sun Yafeng, who would later become Huawei's chairwoman, was the executive who oversaw the construction of this JV network, building what Dow describes as Huawei's marriage to the state through systematic engagement with the provincial telecom bureaucracy.
If the Mobeco structure was Huawei's commercial foundation during this period, the political turning point came in 1994 with a meeting between Ren Zhangfei and Jiang Zemin, then simultaneously the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, the President of the People's Republic, and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. The details of the encounter come almost entirely from Ren's side accounts and have never been independently corroborated through Chinese state media, but the meeting itself is not seriously disputed. At the time, Huawei's annual sales were only around RMB 800 to 900 million, substantial for a private Shenzhen company, but negligible against the national telecom infrastructure budget. Ren reportedly told Zhang that switching equipment technology was related to national security and that a country without its own program-controlled switches was like one without its own military. The formulation was carefully chosen. It wrapped Huawei's commercial interest in the language of national defense, positioning the company not as a profit-seeking enterprise, but as a strategic asset. Zhang reportedly responded with 2 words: "Well said." Whether or not Zhang's endorsement was as immediate and enthusiastic as the Huawei version of the story suggests, the political trajectory that followed was unmistakable. In 1994 or 1995, the exact date is disputed between sources, Huawei won a contract to build the PLA's first national-scale telecommunications network. The contract's financial value was modest. A Huawei employee quoted in Bruce Gilley's 2000 Far Eastern Economic Review investigation described it as small in terms of our overall business, but large in terms of our relationships. The symbolic significance was enormous. Huawei was now a trusted supplier to the Chinese military, which conferred credibility, political protection, and, through the PLA's own procurement networks, access to customers and provinces that might otherwise have been difficult to penetrate. The question of what the PLA contract meant for Huawei's relationship with the Chinese state would become, decades later, the central axis of the entire Western debate over Huawei's trustworthiness. Critics pointed to Ren's military background, to the PLA contract, and to the fact that by 2007, roughly 20% of Huawei's employees were Communist Party members, about 3 times the population rate, as evidence of state control. Defenders pointed out that Ren had never held actual military rank, that the PLA contract was a small fraction of revenue, that the company's ownership structure was genuinely employee-based, and that a White House-ordered 18-month review in 2012 found no evidence that Huawei had spied for China.
The truth was more nuanced than either camp acknowledged. Huawei was neither a state-directed entity nor a purely private one, but rather a company that had learned to navigate the ambiguous space between market and state that defines much of the Chinese private sector. The PLA contract of 1994 to 1995 was the first concrete expression of that navigation. The proceeds from the contract also enabled Huawei to begin scaling its R&D into new product areas, particularly optical transmission and the mobile communication systems that would define its next phase of growth. The political culmination of this period came in 1996, when Beijing launched a major industrial policy campaign to replace foreign telecom equipment with domestic alternatives. The Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, under Minister Wu Jichuan, selected 5 domestic switch manufacturers as designated national champions: Huawei, ZTE, Great Dragon, Datong, and Jinpeng. The first 4 were memorialized in a 4-character mnemonic: Ju Da Zhanghua, Great Dragon, Datong, ZTE, Huawei, whose characters read together can also mean Giant China. The same year, Liu Huaqing, the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, and Wu Bangguo, the vice premier of the State Council, both made high-profile visits to Huawei's Shenzhen headquarters. Wu Bangguo's visit was accompanied by a concrete pledge: RMB 50 million in loans to develop GSM mobile phone technology, which Wu described as a current foreign monopoly in which Huawei should make new breakthroughs. Special import policies that had previously favored foreign equipment vendors were curtailed. Ren himself later acknowledged the dependency plainly. If there had been no government policy to protect nationally owned companies, Huawei would no longer exist. It would be a mistake, however, to read the 1996 Buy Local campaign as the primary driver of Huawei's rise. The campaign confirmed and accelerated a trajectory that was already underway. The deeper structural advantage was the Chinese telecom market itself, which during the 8th five-year plan period of 1991 to 1995 was growing at a pace that beggared imagination.
Telecom operating revenues more than quintupled from 15.2 billion RMB in 1991 to 87.6 billion RMB in 1995, and then jumped again to 120.9 billion RMB in 1996. Fixed-line telephone subscribers rose from roughly 11.5 million in 1992 to nearly 55 million in 1996, a compound annual growth rate of roughly 48%. Telephone penetration, measured as phones per 100 people, went from 1.6 to 6.3 over the same 4 years. And crucially for Huawei's strategy, rural subscriber growth roughly matched urban growth throughout this period, meaning the countryside market that Huawei had targeted was not a backwater niche, but a massive, fast-expanding frontier. Installation fees for a residential telephone line still ran 3,000 to 5,000 yuan, often more than a year's income in rural areas, and waiting lists stretched for months. The demand was effectively insatiable. Any vendor who could deliver a functioning switch at a reasonable price to a county PTA would sell it. The broader market was also shifting in ways that would create enormous new opportunities. In 1994, the State Council approved the creation of China Unicom as a second telecommunications carrier, breaking the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications monopoly. China Unicom was backed by the Ministry of Electronics Industry, the Ministry of Railways, and the Ministry of Electric Power Industry, and was explicitly intended to introduce competition into the mobile telephony market. The first GSM mobile networks were being rolled out across China by both China Telecom and China Unicom starting in 1995, and mobile subscribers were growing even faster than fixed line, from roughly 640,000 in 1993 to 6.85 million in 1996. Motorola and Ericsson dominated the mobile infrastructure market, with Ericsson securing a $400 million framework agreement for digital cellular equipment in 1996, and Motorola signing a $268 million joint venture for TACS and GSM manufacturing.
The mobile revolution was coming, and Huawei was already positioning to participate. The Wu Bangguo loan was the first concrete step toward what would eventually become one of the world's largest mobile network equipment businesses. Against this backdrop of explosive market growth, Huawei's financial trajectory between 1993 and 1996 was extraordinary, even by Chinese standards. From the 100 million RMB starting point in 1992, revenue grew to approximately 800 million RMB in 1994, 1.4 to 1.5 billion RMB in 1995, and 2.6 billion RMB in 1996, a roughly 26-fold increase in 4 years. The C&C08 alone accounted for 1.3 billion RMB of the 1995 figure. By 1996, Huawei held approximately 20% of the Chinese switch market, second only to Shanghai Bell's roughly 33% share. The employee count, which had been about 270 at the start of 1993, grew into the thousands by the end of 1996, with roughly 500 in R&D and 200 in production by the mid-1990s, and the balance in sales, service, and administration. The financing of this growth remained precarious throughout the period. Huawei was still locked out of the state bank credit system that sustained its SOE competitors. The employee stock ownership plan, established in 1990, continued to function as both a retention tool and a critical source of capital. Employees were paid half their wages in cash, with the remainder recorded as share entitlements at 10 RMB per share, redeemable with a 15% annual dividend. The system turned every employee into a de facto investor and bound their financial fortunes to the company's success. Ren's own shareholding was steadily diluted through successive issuances, eventually falling below 2%, a remarkably low figure for a founder-CEO, and one that reflected both the capital needs of the business and Ren's philosophical commitment to shared ownership. The Mobeco joint ventures provided another capital channel. High-interest private borrowing filled the remaining gaps. The first major state bank credit facility, an RMB $3.9 billion buyer's credit line from China Construction Bank, would not arrive until 1998, well after the period covered here. Everything Huawei built between 1993 and 1996 was built on employee equity, customer prepayments, provincial JV capital, and sheer operational intensity. Huawei's competitors during this period were simultaneously collaborators in the national project and threats to its survival. The Chinese switching market that the C&C08 entered was still shaped by the legacy known as 7 countries, 8 systems, the chaotic patchwork of incompatible foreign switching platforms that had been imported piecemeal since the mid-1980s. Alcatel's S1240 from Belgium, Lucen's 5ESS from America, Nortel's DMS100 from Canada, Ericsson's AXE10 from Sweden, Siemens EWSD from Germany, and NEC's NEAX61 and Fujitsu's FETEX 150 from Japan, each province, sometimes each city, had adopted a different standard, creating interoperability nightmares that consumed engineering resources and foreign exchange. The per-line cost of foreign switching equipment had historically exceeded $300, and residential installation fees in mid-sized cities ran 3,000 to 5,000 yuan, with waiting lists that stretched for months. The 7 countries, 8 systems problem was the single most powerful argument for indigenous switch development, and the argument that Ren had weaponized in his pitch to Jiang Zemin. By the time the domestic vendors hit their stride in 1995 and 1996, the aggregate effect was dramatic. Within a few years, per-line switch prices in China collapsed from roughly $300 to $70, and local firm market share, counting both joint ventures like Shanghai Bell and purely indigenous companies like Huawei, surged from less than 50% in the late 1980s to over 90% by 1996. The price collapse was a catastrophe for the foreign incumbents and a bonanza for the hundreds of millions of Chinese who could now afford telephone service. The giant China grouping, Great Dragon, Datong, ZTE, Huawei, was a convenient label for the national champion strategy, but the four companies had radically different structures, capabilities, and trajectories. Great Dragon, built around Wu Jiangxing's HJD04 switch at the PLA Information Engineering Institute, had been the government's original choice for national champion, not Huawei. It received approximately $2.2 billion per year in state investment, a figure that dwarfed anything available to Huawei. But Great Dragon was organized as a state-owned consortium that had licensed production of the HJD04 to 14 separate factories, creating a structure that proved fatally unwieldy. Internal price wars among the licensed producers, software quality problems, and a catastrophic 1996 incident in which a dozen Great Dragon switches failed simultaneously due to a software bug sent the company into a decline from which it never recovered. The PLA divestiture order of 1999 forced Wu Jiangxing to resign and return to the Information Engineering University, and Great Dragon was effectively dead by the early 2000s. The lesson Huawei drew, that technology without commercial coherence was insufficient, shaped its later obsession with integrated management and end-to-end control. Datong, the third member of the quartet, was a research institute spin-off that began mass production of its SP30 switch in 1995 and would later become important as the developer of the TD-SCDMA 3G standard. But during 1993 to 1996, it was primarily a research arm rather than a serious commercial competitor. ZTE, by contrast, was Huawei's most direct rival and its nearest structural analog. Founded in 1985 in Shenzhen, just 2 years before Huawei, ZTE had followed a remarkably similar path, from consumer electronics trading to PBX manufacturing to digital switch development, with a rural-first sales strategy and aggressive pricing. Its ZXJ10 digital switch was a capable competitor to the C&C08. But ZTE's ownership structure was different in a way that would prove consequential. It was officially state-owned, but operated under a state-owned, privately managed hybrid model, and it listed on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in 1997, giving it access to public equity capital. Huawei, by deliberate choice, remained private, funding itself through the ESOP and JV structures that Ren believed gave the company greater agility and longer-term orientation. The Huawei-ZTE rivalry would intensify over the following decades, but by 1996, both companies were growing fast enough that the market could accommodate them. The foreign incumbents remained formidable. Shanghai Bell, the Alcatel joint venture, controlled roughly a third of the voice switching market and was the default choice for major city deployments. Beijing International Switching Corporation, a Siemens joint venture established in 1990, manufactured EWSD switches for the capital and northern China. Ericsson, NEC, Fujitsu, Lucent, Nortel, and Motorola each maintained significant joint ventures and direct sales operations. By 1998, Lucent alone had 6 joint ventures in China. But the domestic vendor's market share was rising relentlessly, from less than 50% in the late 1980s to over 90% by 1996, according to the academic study by Mu and Li. The foreign vendors' retreat was driven by the convergence of government buy local policy, domestic vendors' 30 to 50% price advantage, and the simple logistics of serving China's vast rural hinterland.
Eva Du captured the aggregate effect in a single statistic. Within a few years of the domestic switchmaker's emergence, the price of telephone switches in China dropped from roughly $300 per line to $70 per line. While the C&C08 was Huawei's flagship, the period from 1993 to 1996 also saw the beginnings of product diversification that would define the company's next chapter. Under Zhang Baoyang's leadership, the Central Research Institute, formally established in 1995 with Zhang as its first president, expanded from switching into fiber access networks, broadband switching, SCH optical transmission equipment, and early mobile communications research. The The C&C08's modular architecture proved to be not just a product, but a platform. Its hardware framework, software development environment, and manufacturing processes were adapted and extended into adjacent telecom product categories. As one Chinese technology commentator later observed, all of Huawei's later products, transmission, mobile, intelligent networking, data communications, were developed on this platform. In 1995, Huawei established research centers in Shanghai, focused on data communication and routers, and in Beijing, focused on mobile communications equipment. For routers, engineers reportedly reverse-engineered basic components from disassembled foreign equipment, the same absorb and improve approach that had characterized the C&C08's own development. Huawei also began purchasing microchips and key components from Motorola and Texas Instruments, establishing supplier relationships that would deepen over the following decade. An intellectual property department was created in 1995, signaling a shift from pure development toward the patent accumulation strategy that would later become one of Huawei's most powerful competitive weapons. The organizational transformation required to support this growth was, if anything, more dramatic than the technical achievements. A company of 270 people operating from a single industrial floor can be managed through direct oversight and personal relationships. A company of several thousand spread across research centers in 3 cities and sales offices in every Chinese province cannot. The challenge was compounded by the speed of hiring. Huawei was absorbing hundreds of fresh graduates per year, primarily from HUST, but also from other top Chinese engineering universities, and promoting them at rates that would have been inconceivable in a traditional SOE or Western multinational. Huawei's salary premiums were a key weapon in the talent war. In 1993, a new undergraduate hire at Huawei started at 1,000 yuan per month, roughly double what a university teaching position paid. Master's graduates earned 1,500 yuan and PhDs 2,000 yuan. But the real money came from rapid promotions and equity. Li Yinan, who joined on February 27, 1993, saw his monthly compensation rise from 500 to 1,500 to 2,600 yuan within his first year, against the roughly 400 yuan he had earned as a Jiaotong University instructor. Chao Yian, the C&C08 project lead, was earning 5,000 to 6,000 yuan per month, the 7th highest salary in the company, at a time when comparable SOE engineers might earn a tenth of that. Combined with the ESOP shares that accumulated with every year of service, the compensation package created a gravitational pull that drew the best engineering talent in China toward a company that, by any conventional measure, should not have been able to compete for it. The key personnel who would lead Huawei for the next 3 decades were all in place or arriving during this period. Guo Ping, who had joined in 1988 as the 5th employee and had recruited Zhang Baoyang, moved through field installation into R&D project management, supply chain, and corporate development. Ken Hu, who joined in 1990 with a bachelor's degree from HUST, was building the domestic sales organization that would later become the foundation of Huawei's global go-to-market structure. Eric Xu, who joined in 1993 with a PhD from Nanjing University of Science and Technology, was rising through the Wireless Network Research Group. And Sun Yafeng, who had joined in 1989 after a career that included stints at a Xinjiang radio factory, the China Research Institute of Radio Wave Propagation, and, according to contested reports from Japanese and U.S. intelligence sources, the Ministry of State Security's Communications Department, was consolidating her position as REN's most trusted organizational architect. Sun Yafeng's most consequential acts during this period came on January 28, 1996, when she led what became known as Huawei's collective resignation of the marketing department. The mechanics were theatrical, and deliberately so. Each regional sales office director was told to prepare 2 documents, a work summary and a written resignation letter. REN announced that he would sign only one of the 2. The standard resignation letter, drafted for the occasion, read in part, I have fought for the company's sales development and sacrificed my youth, but my technical and business ability may not have kept up. If the company identifies a more suitable person for sales work, I will sincerely resign. Roughly 30% of middle and senior cadres in the marketing department withdrew from their positions. The event was described inside Huawei using a classical Chinese historical allusion, drinking wine to release military power, a reference to the Song dynasty emperor Zhao Kuangyin's famous stratagem for peacefully disarming his generals. The purpose was organizational renewal. Huawei had started in rural markets, and many of its early sales managers were provincial in their experience and limited in their professional networks. As Huawei prepared to enter larger cities and eventually international markets, the old guard had to make way for a new generation or prove they could compete for their own jobs. Ren's tribute to the departing managers was characteristically layered with affection and ruthlessness. He said he loved them, especially those who had sacrificed themselves and paved the way for tomorrow. But he also loved tomorrow, and for the sake of tomorrow, they must correct today. In a separate speech to the sales force around this time, Ren offered what may be his most revealing description of the ideal Huawei salesperson. Sales work, he said, is special, complex, and noble. You need the intelligence of a scientist, the insight of a philosopher, the eloquence of an orator, the ambition of a social reformer, and the optimism and persistent spirit of a religious man. The description was aspirational rather than descriptive. The typical Huawei field salesperson in 1996 was a 20-something HUST graduate sleeping on a county hotel floor and nursing a Baiju hangover, but it captured the seriousness with which Ren viewed the commercial function. That same year, Ren published an internal essay inspired by the Japanese song Kitsaguni no Haru, Northern Country Spring, that became one of his most widely circulated early pieces of writing inside the company. The essay wove together themes of melancholy, sacrifice, and the pain of separation from family with a sharp-edged critique of complacency. Ren wrote of being separated from his family for 5 years, of the harshness of the work, and of the need to prepare for winter even in the midst of growth, the perpetual crisis consciousness that would become one of Huawei's most distinctive cultural traits. The mattress culture, the wolf culture, the collective resignation, and the Northern Country Spring essay were all facets of the same underlying reality. Ren was building an organization whose emotional register was permanently set to existential urgency, in which no amount of success was permitted to breed complacency, and in which the memory of the JK-1000 disaster and the 1993 near bankruptcy was kept alive as institutional scar tissue. The collective resignation was the most dramatic expression of a broader cultural system that was hardening into doctrine during 1993 to 1996. The mattress culture, the rolled-up bedding stowed under desks, the 24-hour shifts, the engineers who did not return to their dormitories for weeks at a stretch, was formally documented for the first time in a Huawei People newsletter article published on October 29, 1996, by an employee named Shi Wenjin. The article described how almost every Huawei person kept a mattress rolled at the bottom of their iron storage cabinet or under their desk, how during lunch they would lie on the floor, how during night overtime shifts, with sparse lights in the quiet building, many people would go entire months without returning to their dormitories, sleeping when tired and working when awake, in an alternation of day and night that erased the boundary between them. The mattress, she wrote, was half a home. Ren himself traced the practice to the company's earliest days, when 5 or 6 developers worked in conditions explicitly modeled on the Mao era 2 bombs, 1 satellite program, the Chinese nuclear and space weapons effort that had been conducted under conditions of extreme privation and total commitment. One employee recalled pulling out his mattress to sleep after a late-night overtime session and waking to find Ren sleeping on a mattress next to him. Ren was also known to push midnight meal carts through the building, delivering food to engineers still working. The wolf culture complemented the mattress culture with a predatory edge.
Ren articulated 3 characteristics of wolves that he wanted to see in every Huawei employee: keen sense of smell, meaning hyper-attentiveness to market signals and customer needs, an unyielding, fearless attacking spirit, and the instinct for group struggle, meaning collective combat rather than individual heroism. In 1996, Ren told employees that the mountain goat must outrun the lion to avoid being eaten, and that all departments must optimize and eliminate the lazy goats, those who did not learn, did not progress, and had no sense of responsibility. The martial language was not accidental. Ren's management rhetoric drew directly on his PLA background, emphasizing goal clarity, discipline, sacrifice, and what he called absolute obedience, while also stressing the obligation to take care of the troops through high pay and equity participation. Victory was to be celebrated with toasts. In defeat, everyone must fight to save one another. The formula produced results that were spectacular and, by any humane standard, unsustainable. But in the 1993 to 1996 window, with the company's survival literally at stake, sustainability was not the relevant criterion. Alongside the operational frenzy, Ren was also beginning to build the intellectual infrastructure that would discipline Huawei's growth over the longer term. In late 1994, visiting officials began praising Huawei's distinctive corporate culture, and Ren tasked a deputy to engage professors from Renmin University of China to formalize and codify the company's values and operating principles. By 1995, drafting had begun on what would eventually be called the Huawei Basic Law, a 103-article, 16,400-word corporate constitution that would take 3 years and 8 major drafts to complete. The drafting team, later known as the Six Gentlemen, was led by Ping Jianfeng and included Wu Chunbo, who would later co-author the authorized Huawei history. Ren's motivation was explicitly defensive. After 1997, he later reflected, the company's internal thinking had become chaotic, with competing factions pushing for an IPO, real estate diversification, relaxed R&D spending, and other directions that Ren views as existential threats to the core business. The Basic Law was designed to settle these debates by writing the answers into a quasi-constitutional document that would bind all employees. Its most famous principle was the commitment to invest at least 10% of annual revenue in R&D, a rule that had been practiced informally since the early 1990s but was now enshrined as organizational law. The document would not be formally adopted until March 23, 1998, at a ceremony in Minghua Villa in Nanshan District, but its intellectual foundations were laid during the 1993 to 1996 period, and the drafting process itself served as a vehicle for the kind of institutional self-examination that Ren believed was essential to surviving rapid growth. The period also saw Huawei's first tentative steps beyond China's borders. In January 1994, Ren traveled to the United States, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Las Vegas, on what appears to have been a benchmarking tour that likely included visits to IBM, Bell Labs, and AT&T. The trip was transformative. His published reflections, appearing in Huawei People under the title Notes from a Trip to America, struck a tone of awed ambition mixed with competitive determination. Central Park was so big, he wrote, that they walked for half a day and realized upon checking the map that they had covered only a small corner. The metaphor was unmistakable. America was vast, its technology companies operated at a scale that made Huawei look microscopic, and the distance between where Huawei stood and where it needed to go was far greater than it appeared from Shenzhen. But Ren returned from America not discouraged, but galvanized. The trip planted the seed for what would eventually become Huawei's most important organizational transformation, the decision to hire IBM's consulting division to overhaul Huawei's management systems, a decision that would not be executed until August 1998, but whose intellectual origins lay in Ren's 1994 encounter with American corporate discipline. In the meantime, Huawei's management remained, as Eva Du memorably describes it, vibrant but undisciplined. Things were sometimes just scrawled on sticky notes, processes were ad hoc, and the organizational chart was more a suggestion than a structure. The contrast between the products Huawei was building and the systems it was using to manage them was becoming untenable, and Ren knew it. In 1995, Huawei mounted a small exhibition in Geneva, but the first serious international push came in August 1996 when Huawei exhibited at the 8th Moscow International Communication Exhibition with over 600 exhibitors from more than 30 countries. The company prepared tens of thousands of brochures, hired Russian water ballet dancers as booth receptionists, and recruited Chinese students studying in Russia as interpreters.
The backdrop was challenging. Chinese small traders had flooded Russia with counterfeit and shoddy goods in the years following the Soviet collapse, and some Russian stores had posted signs reading "No Chinese goods sold here." Ren's approach was to lead with the C&C08's technical credentials, particularly its power efficiency. He pitched Russian officials on the fact that the C&C08's standard version consumed only 60 amps versus 300 amps for comparable foreign models, a 5-to-1 advantage that mattered enormously in a country with unreliable electrical infrastructure. Russia's Minister and Vice Minister of Posts and Telecommunications both visited the Huawei booth. TASS reported on the company twice. Ren set a 3-year target: enter the Russian market by 1999. The Moscow exhibition also produced one of Ren's most revealing early pieces of strategic writing. In an article titled "Notes from an Exhibition in Russia," published in Huawei People on August 26, 1996, he laid out a geopolitical framework for Huawei's international ambitions that explicitly linked the company's commercial strategy to China's national trajectory. With the improvement of Sino-Russian relations, he wrote, the United States would realize that the Earth was still rotating without it, and China would certainly become rich and strong. The United States could not contain China just as it wished. The framing was a preview of the rhetoric that would define Huawei's public posture during the U.S. sanctions era 2 decades later. In the same period, Huawei also made side trips to Bulgaria, Romania, Azerbaijan, and the Baltic states, and, most significantly, won its first international customer contract with Hutchison Telecom in Hong Kong, Li Ka-shing's telecommunications arm. Ren's own August 1996 article refers to the Hong Kong entry in the past tense, suggesting the deal was concluded by mid-1996, though some sources date the public announcement to 1997. In either case, the Hutchison contract marked Huawei's transition from a domestic company with international aspirations to an international company with its first foreign revenue. By the end of 1996, Huawei was a fundamentally different entity from the one that had gathered in the Cisco auditorium 3 years earlier. Revenue had grown from 100 million RMB to 2.6 billion RMB. The C&C08 had been deployed in thousands of county and township telephone exchanges across China, had won military and railway contracts, had entered the Hong Kong market, and had been exhibited to international audiences in Geneva and Moscow. The employee count had multiplied by roughly an order of magnitude. The company had established research centers in 3 cities, begun diversifying into transmission and mobile equipment, and laid the intellectual foundations for the Huawei Basic Law. It had survived the JK1000 disaster, the near bankruptcy of 1993, the agonizing Yiwu deployment, and the daily reality of building a technology company without state bank financing in a market still dominated by well-capitalized multinationals, backed by a century of accumulated engineering knowledge and deep relationships with China's provincial telecom establishment. The political alignment with Beijing through the Jiang Zemin meeting, the PLA contract, the provincial JV network, and the 1996 national champion designation had given Huawei a strategic position that no competitor could easily replicate.
But it is important to be precise about what the 1996 designation actually meant and what it did not. Huawei was not, in 1996, a state-owned enterprise, a state-directed enterprise, or a creature of the Chinese Communist Party. It was a private collective whose founder happened to be a former PLA engineer, whose growth had been financed primarily by its own employees and by provincial telecom bureau investments, and whose products had won market share through a combination of low pricing, extreme service intensity, and government procurement preference. The state's role was enabling, not directing. It created the conditions, import substitution policy, rural telecom investment, national champion designation, under which Huawei could compete, but it did not tell Huawei what to build, how to build it, or where to sell it. Ren's own acknowledgement that Huawei would not exist without government protection was an honest statement about market structure, not a confession of state control. The relationship was one of mutual dependence and mutual wariness, and it would remain so for decades.
The final portrait of Huawei at the end of 1996 is a company in which all the elements of its future identity, the R&D obsession, the employee ownership structure, the wolf and mattress work culture, the rural to urban to global market strategy, the political alignment with Beijing that was simultaneously genuine and transactional, the product platform approach that leveraged a single core technology across multiple product lines, and the institutional paranoia that treated every success as a prelude to the next crisis, were already present and operational. What the 1993 to 1996 period added to the 1987 to 1992 foundation was not a new strategic direction, but a proof of concept. The C&C08 demonstrated that Huawei could build a product competitive with the best in the world. The rural-encirclement strategy demonstrated that it could sell that product at scale. The Mobeco and provincial JV structures demonstrated that it could finance growth without depending on state banks. And the political relationship with Jiang Zemin, Wu Bongguo, and the PLA demonstrated that it could secure the institutional cover necessary to survive in a system where private enterprise was still politically suspect. Each of these demonstrations was incomplete. The C&C08 was buggy, the sales force was provincial, the financing was precarious, and the political cover was conditional, but each was sufficient to sustain the next round of investment and the next escalation of ambition. Ren Zhengfei had promised to jump from a building if the C&C08 failed. It did not fail. The question that the next chapter of Huawei's history would answer was whether the formula that worked in China's counties and townships, low price, extreme service, institutional alignment, employee ownership, and relentless product iteration could work in Shanghai, in Moscow, in Nairobi, in London, and eventually in every telecommunications market on Earth. The answer, as the world would discover over the following 2 decades, was more complicated and more consequential for the global technology order than either Ren's admirers or his critics expected. The Great Transformation, How Huawei Professionalized, Survived the Bust, and Went Global, 1997 to 2003. At the start of 1997, Huawei Technologies was the most successful company in China that nobody outside China had ever heard of. Its revenue had just crossed RMB 4.1 billion. Its C&C08 digital switch dominated the rural and county-level telephone market. It had roughly 5,600 employees, a growing campus in Shenzhen, and a single international customer, a small contract with Li Ka-shing's Hutchison and Whampoa in Hong Kong that had been signed the previous year. The mattress culture was in full flower. Engineers still slept under their desks, sales teams still drank themselves into hepatitis at county bureau banquets, and Ren Zhengfei still pushed midnight meal carts through the R&D building. Everything about Huawei radiated intensity, ambition, and chaos. The chaos was the problem, as Wu Chunbo, one of the Renmin University professors who had spent 3 years drafting Huawei's corporate constitution, would later observe. The company's internal thinking had become deeply disordered. Multiple factions pushed competing agendas. Some wanted an IPO, some wanted to diversify into real estate, some wanted to relax the punishing R&D investment pace. Departments operated as feudal baronies, with product development following a serial ad hoc
feedback process in which marketing threw requests over the wall to R&D, R&D threw prototypes over the wall to manufacturing, and manufacturing scrambled to deliver products that were frequently late, sometimes defective, and occasionally irrelevant to what customers had actually ordered. On-time delivery was running at roughly 50% against 94% at Western competitors. Annual inventory turnover was 3.6 times versus 9.4 times at peer companies. Huawei's return on R&D investment was, by Ren's later calculation, only 1/6 of IBM's. The wolf culture could win battles in rural Chinese counties where the competition was weak and the customer was forgiving. It could not run a global company, and Ren, who had been reading voraciously about American management since his first trip to the United States in 1993, knew it. The 7 years from 1997 to 2003 would transform Huawei from a fast-growing but institutionally primitive Chinese switchmaker into a credible global telecommunications vendor, a metamorphosis executed through 3 intertwined campaigns that reinforced each other at every step. The first was ideological, the adoption on March 23, 1998, of Huawei Basic Law, a 103-article corporate constitution that codified the company's values, strategic boundaries, and operating principles into a quasi-legal document that every employee was required to read and internalize.
The second was operational, a multi-year, multi-hundred-million-dollar management overhaul led by IBM Global Services Consultants, supplemented by Hay Group, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Mercer, Accenture, and a retired Toyota production director that would impose Western standard integrated product development and integrated supply chain processes on an organization that had previously managed itself through personal authority and collective willpower. The third was geographic, an international expansion that applied the countryside surrounds the cities doctrine at the global scale, entering Russia, Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and eventually Europe, while Western competitors retreated from emerging markets during the dot-com bust. These 3 campaigns did not unfold in tidy sequence. They overlapped, collided, and fed each other. The Basic Law gave Ren the doctrinal authority to impose IBM's methods on resistant engineers. The IBM methods gave Huawei the management infrastructure to scale internationally. International exposure revealed the gaps that demanded further management professionalization, and all 3 campaigns were conducted under conditions of near-continuous crisis. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 1998, which gutted Huawei's nascent Russian business, the dot-com and telecom bust of 2001 to 2002, which devastated every major Western equipment vendor and threatened Huawei's own growth trajectory, the defection of Li Yinan, the crown prince of Huawei's R&D organization, to found a direct competitor, and the Cisco Systems lawsuit of 2003, which alleged that Huawei had copied router source code and threatened to brand the company as a technology thief in its most important future market. The fact that Huawei survived all 4 of these crises and emerged from the period stronger than any of its Western competitors is the central story of this chapter. The ideological foundation was laid first. The Huawei Basic Law had been in gestation since late 1994, when Ren, frustrated by a public discussion at which his own managers could not agree on what Huawei's culture actually was, assigned a deputy to engage professors from Renmin University of China to articulate the company's values and success factors. 6 academics were eventually recruited for the drafting team: Peng Jianfeng, who served as the principal drafter and coordinator, Bao Zhang, Wu Chunbo, who would later co-author the authorized Huawei history, Wang Weiwei, Yang Du, and Sun Jianmin. The group became known inside the company as the Liu Junzi, the 6 gentlemen, and they would spend 3 years immersed in Huawei, interviewing executives and engineers, debating drafts with senior managers who were each required by Ren's order to set aside 2 days a month for the process, and revising the document through 8 major iterations. The drafting process was deliberately slow and deliberately collective, and Ren used it as an instrument of cultural alignment as much as a document production exercise.
Each draft forced the management team to confront questions they had been avoiding. What was Huawei's core business, and what would it never do? Who owned the value the company created? The founder, the engineers, the investors, or the customers? How should the company balance short-term profitability against long-term R&D investment? What was the relationship between individual heroism and institutional process? By the time the answers were codified in the final document, the management team had internalized the arguments behind them. The Basic Law was adopted not as an imposition from above, but as the product of a 3-year internal debate, which was precisely why it worked. The document's formal adoption came on March 23, 1998, at a ceremony at Minghua Villa in Shenzhen's Nanshan district. In its final form, the Basic Law comprised 103 articles arranged in 6 chapters covering core values, basic business strategy, organizational structure, human resource policy, business division control, and continuous improvement. Several provisions would prove strategically decisive. The 10% rule committed Huawei to investing no less than 10% of annual revenue in research and development, an extraordinarily high ratio that Huawei has maintained for nearly 3 decades, and that by 2020 would translate to annual R&D spending exceeding that of most European nations. The customer centricity principle declared the customer, not the technology and not the founder, to be the locus of all value, a concept Ren had absorbed directly from studying Louis Gerstner's turnaround at IBM. The 4 elements of value creation, knowledge, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, defined who would share in the company's wealth and provided the philosophical foundation for the employee stock ownership structure that made every engineer a shareholder.
In Article 22, the famous renunciation declared that Huawei would never enter the information services industry, meaning it would never operate networks, become a carrier, or compete with its own customers. This single rule would prove to be one of the most consequential strategic commitments in modern corporate history, preserving Huawei's relationship with telecom operators worldwide, while competitors like UT Starcom chased the late 1990s internet services bubble and were destroyed by it. Ren himself has described the Basic Law as a transitional document, necessary for its moment but insufficient for the next phase. Its categories were descriptive and aspirational rather than operational. Its language could not, as Ren put it, form a good dialogue with large global companies. What it could do, and what it did, was provide the doctrinal authority for the far more painful transformation that was about to begin, the IBM engagement. The decision to hire IBM was rooted in a trip Ren made to the United States in late December 1997, Christmas week, leading a senior delegation that visited IBM, Bell Labs, Hewlett-Packard, and Hughes Electronics. The trip was the practical sequel to his earlier 1993 visit to Boston, New York, and Silicon Valley, which he had memorialized in a celebrated 1994 essay in the company newspaper Huawei People that has been translated under various titles, including Notes from a Trip to America and What Should We Learn from the American People. In the 1993 essay, Ren had argued that the gulf between Chinese and American R&D was principally about management process rather than raw talent or capital, and he had ended with a vow to study American technology and Japanese management. The essay contains a passage that, read with the benefit of hindsight, amounts to a strategic manifesto for the next quarter century. In the information and communications industry, Ren wrote, "You either take the lead or you get wiped out. There are no other paths." That single formulation, binary survival, no comfortable middle ground, would justify the IBM engagement, the WCDMA investment, the aggressive international expansion, and every subsequent bet the company decision that Huawei would make. Its power lay in its simplicity. By framing the choice as existential rather than incremental, Ren made every conservative option look like a death sentence, and every bold gamble look like prudent self-preservation. The 1997 trip converted that philosophical framework into a procurement decision. The encounter with IBM under Louis Gerstner made the deepest impression.
Gerstner's turnaround of IBM, which would later be described in his memoir, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance, had begun in 1993 with a crisis remarkably similar to Huawei's emerging problems: cost overruns, missed delivery schedules, departmental warlordism, and a return on R&D investment that had fallen to alarming levels. IBM's response had been the integrated product development methodology, derived from the PACE framework developed by management consultants Pitlio, Rabin, Todd, and McGrath, combined with integrated supply chain management. Ren learned that IBM had spent the equivalent of $8 billion on its own internal transformation. The math was compelling. If Huawei's R&D return was 1/6 of IBM's, then matching IBM's process discipline represented a 5-fold productivity multiplier and was worth almost any consulting fee. By the time the delegation returned to Shenzhen in early 1998, the decision had been made. The formal contract with IBM Global Services was signed in August 1998. IBM would help Huawei design and implement, in sequence, an integrated product development system, an integrated supply chain system, an information technology strategy and plan, and supporting financial management standardizations. The cost was enormous. The initial IPD contract was budgeted at approximately $50 million, but the total consulting bill escalated substantially over the 5-year engagement, with credible estimates ranging from $240 million to $300 million for the IPD and ISC phases alone. At the engagement's peak, roughly 70 IBM consultants were permanently stationed in Shenzhen, billing at approximately $500 per hour. Ren has told interviewers in subsequent years that Huawei has spent more than $100 million a year on management consultants, and that the cumulative IBM bill across 2 decades exceeds $1 billion. Whatever the precise figure, it represented several percent of annual revenue and was comfortably the largest management consulting engagement ever undertaken in China. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Huawei's engineers, educated in China's collectivist tradition, accustomed to flat hierarchies and rapid informal coordination, proud of the wolf culture intensity that had built the C&C08 from nothing, balked at IBM's structured cross-functional product development teams, phase gate review processes, and integrated portfolio management teams. The templates were imported wholesale from IBM's own practices, written in English management jargon that had no natural Chinese equivalent. Ren's engineers felt they were being asked to replace a working culture with foreign bureaucracy. They were not entirely wrong, but Ren's response was the instruction that became the most famous metaphor of the entire transformation: cut your feet to fit the shoes, in Chinese, 书足洗路. The phrase is a deliberate inversion of a classical idiom that normally warns against the absurdity of self-mutilation to match an ill-fitting garment. Ren embraced the absurdity. He ordered Huawei to mutilate its own habits, processes, and instincts in order to fit the IBM templates exactly. No local adaptation would be permitted in the early rigidification phase. Every department head was placed on the transformation team and warned that failure to advance the IPD implementation meant exit from the company. Tinkering would be allowed only later, in what Ren called the optimization and solidification phases, after the basic discipline had been absorbed. The implementation ran from February 1999 through 2003 in 3 overlapping phases: rigidification, optimization, and solidification, with the first integrated portfolio management team formally established only in 2003, 5 years after the project began. The full company-wide rollout continued through 2008. This was not a quick fix. It was an institutional reprogramming that took a decade, consumed hundreds of millions of dollars, and required the founder to spend enormous personal capital overriding the objections of his own most talented people. Even as IBM led the central engagement, Ren methodically distributed adjacent management functions to other specialist Western firms. The Hay Group designed Huawei's job grading, compensation, and qualification management systems beginning in 1997. the matrix that still underpins Huawei's human resources architecture. PricewaterhouseCoopers led financial management standardization through a project called the Four Standardizations that ran from 1998 to 2007. KPMG provided auditing services. Mercer Consulting helped redesign organizational structures. Towers Perrin contributed specialized HR consulting. Accenture later took on sales process redesign. A retired Toyota production director was brought in to run a senior manufacturing team for a decade. German production engineers were hired to standardize manufacturing processes. Ren's philosophy was unambiguous, and for the founder of a company built on Chinese nationalist pride, remarkably humble. Huawei would not pretend to invent management. It would buy it from whoever had the best version available. The results, when they came, were transformative. By 2003, IBM consultants reported that Huawei's R&D losses, defined as the percentage of R&D investment that produced no commercially viable product, had fallen from 25% to 6%. The expenditure ratio for waste had compressed from 12% to 6%. Time to market for new products improved substantially. On-time delivery, which had been 50% in 1999, climbed toward the Western competitor benchmark of 94%. Inventory turnover improved. Most importantly, the company had acquired the management chassis that would allow it to scale its R&D organization from thousands of engineers to tens of thousands, eventually more than 100,000, while maintaining, in the words of Eric Su in a later interview, an ability to operate in an orderly manner because of our IPD process. The management transformation was not conducted in a vacuum. It unfolded against the backdrop of Huawei's first serious push beyond China's borders, a campaign that would test every element of the company's strategy, culture, and resilience against conditions that no amount of domestic success could have prepared it for. The international expansion began, as the domestic expansion had, in the countryside. Ren's doctrine was explicit. Apply Mao's encirclement strategy at the global scale. Enter developing markets that Western vendors had either neglected or abandoned. Build reference customers and operational competence in conditions where the bar for quality was lower and price sensitivity was higher. Accumulate experience, revenue, and reputation, and only then, from a position of proven capability rather than aspiration, move up market into the developed economies where Ericsson, Alcatel, Lucent, and Nortel held entrenched positions.
Russia was the first major international target, and it provided the first major international lesson in failure and resilience. In 1997, Ren personally traveled to Ufa to sign the Beto-Huawei joint venture, establishing a Russian manufacturing and distribution footprint. The timing could hardly have been worse. The Asian financial crisis, which had begun in Thailand in July 1997, metastasized through Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines before reaching Russia in the summer of 1998. On August 17, 1998, the Russian government defaulted on its domestic debt and devalued the ruble, which collapsed from roughly 6 to 20 rubles per dollar in a matter of weeks. Russian telecom operators' procurement budgets evaporated overnight. Huawei's first commercial order in Russia famously settled at a payment equivalent to just $12 during the depths of the crisis. The Beto-Huawei joint venture was forced into hibernation. Huawei's Russia head reportedly told his remaining staff to leave and come back when business returned. Ren refused to retreat. His reasoning was strategic rather than sentimental. If Huawei pulled out of Russia during the crisis, it would lose whatever relationships and market knowledge it had built, and when Russian operators eventually resumed spending, which they would because telephone networks are essential infrastructure, Western competitors would be there first. But if Huawei stayed, absorbing short-term losses, it would be the last vendor standing when the market recovered, precisely because Western vendors, answerable to quarterly earnings expectations, would pull back faster. The bet was correct. By 2001, Russian sales had recovered to roughly $100 million.
By the mid-2000s, Russia would be one of Huawei's top 3 international markets, with contracts across Beeline, Megaphone, and other major operators. The 1998 Russian crisis became the founding template of what would later be recognized as Huawei's distinctive crisis strategy. While peers retreated from damaged markets, Huawei doubled down and absorbed the vacated market share. Sub-Saharan Africa was the second concentric ring of international expansion, and the one that would ultimately generate the deepest commercial roots. Huawei entered Kenya in 1998, its first African market, and rapidly expanded into Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, Mauritius, Morocco, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The African strategy replicated the Chinese rural playbook with remarkable fidelity. Huawei offered equipment at prices 30 to 70% below Western alternatives, bundled financing through Chinese state bank buyers' credit facilities, stationed engineers on site at customer premises for months at a time, and built training centers to develop local technical capacity. In November 2000, Vice Premier Wu Bangguo traveled with Ren on a diplomatic tour that laid the groundwork for a series of state finance deals, including a $20 million Ethiopia contract in 2003 and a later $200 million CDMA 450 project in Nigeria in 2005. The regional CDMA 450 reference networks that Huawei built in Ethiopia and Nigeria became sales templates that could be shown to prospective customers across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. By the mid-2000s, Africa would generate roughly 15% of Huawei's global revenue. The African expansion was not without controversy. Huawei's willingness to work with governments that Western companies avoided on human rights grounds, and the Chinese state financing that accompanied Huawei's bids, drew criticism that would intensify over the following decades. But from a purely commercial perspective, the African strategy was a textbook execution of the bottom-of-the-pyramid market entry that Clayton Christensen had theorized in The Innovator's Dilemma. Incumbent vendors served the high-margin, high-specification urban markets of Europe and America while ignoring the vast, price-sensitive, underserved markets of the developing world. Huawei filled the gap. Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America followed in rapid succession. Huawei opened a Thailand office and won fixed-line contracts in the late 1990s. Brazil, Pakistan, India, and the UAE came shortly after. A sale to Etisalat in the UAE in 2003 made the Emirates one of the first countries in the Arab world with third-generation mobile service. Each new market added another data point to Huawei's accumulating body of international operational experience and another reference customer that could be cited in the next sales pitch. The breach into Europe, the market that truly mattered for global credibility, came in 2001. The Dutch operator Telford placed Huawei's first major European contract for software-upgradable wireless base stations, a deal won by combining significantly lower hardware costs with feature parity against established vendors. German optical network sales using the Optics SDH product line followed.
By 2003, Huawei was supplying France's NUF and several other second-tier European carriers. The European contracts were individually small, but they served a purpose disproportionate to their revenue. They proved that Huawei could meet European quality and regulatory standards, which had long been the implicit argument that Western competitors used to keep Chinese vendors out of their home markets. The United States was the hardest market, and the one where Huawei made the least progress during this period. On Valentine's Day 2001, Huawei opened an office in Plano, Texas, under the subsidiary name FutureWay Technologies. By the time of the Cisco lawsuit in January 2003, Huawei had not signed a single American carrier customer. The reasons were partly commercial. American carriers had deep relationships with Lucent, Nortel, and Cisco, and partly political. The legacy of Ren's PLA background and the persistent suspicion in Washington that Huawei was a state-directed entity made American operators cautious.
The H3C joint venture with 3Com agreed in principle in March 2003 and formally incorporated that November, was Huawei's first significant American partnership, and it was driven as much by litigation strategy as by commercial logic, a point to which we will return. Quantitatively, the international expansion progressed from near zero revenue in 1996 to over $100 million by 2000, $328 million in 2001, $552 million in 2002, and roughly $1.05 billion in 2003, about 27% of total revenue. By the end of 2001, Huawei had established offices in 45 countries. The trajectory was unmistakable. Huawei was becoming a global company, and the speed of the transformation was faster than any Western competitor had anticipated. Meanwhile, the domestic market that had built Huawei was undergoing its own dramatic restructuring. The Asian financial crisis had paradoxical effects on China's telecom sector. China itself escaped direct currency crisis. The yuan was not freely convertible, and Beijing held the exchange rate peg, but the crisis accelerated Beijing's nationalist industrial policy turn. The 1996 Buy Local Directive was reinforced, import substitution intensified, and the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications was itself being restructured. In 1998, it was folded into the newly created Ministry of Information Industry, which would oversee the separation of the postal system from telecommunications and the reorganization of China's carriers into the structure China Telecom, China Mobile, China Unicom, and later China Netcom that would define the market for the next decade. The most consequential structural change came from an unexpected direction. On July 22, 1998, at a national anti-smuggling seminar in Beijing, Jiang Zemin issued a blunt directive requiring the People's Liberation Army, the People's Armed Police, and law enforcement bodies to cease all commercial activities. The order initiated what scholars call the second phase divestiture of military business enterprises, with transfer deadlines set to December 15, 1998, and legal cleanup continuing through 1999. The PLA had been running an enormous commercial empire, an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 enterprises generating perhaps $10 billion annually, encompassing everything from hotels and farms to telecommunications and pharmaceutical companies. The divestiture was driven by Jiang's concern that military commercial activities were fostering corruption and undermining combat readiness, and it represented the most significant military economic reform since Deng Xiaoping's original downsizing of the 1980s. For Huawei, the PLA divestiture has often been overread in the West as definitively severing the company's relationship with the Chinese military. The reality was more nuanced. Huawei had never been owned by the PLA in any direct sense. Ren had left the military in 1983, and the company was incorporated as a private collective in 1987. But Huawei had won the mid-1990s contract to build the PLA's first national telecommunications network, and the provincial joint ventures through which Huawei sold equipment to local telecom bureaus included some entities with PLA-adjacent connections. The 1998 divestiture order accelerated Huawei's formalization and helped justify the corporate restructuring that would, between 2001 and 2003, buy out the provincial joint venture shell shareholders and consolidate ownership under the trade union shareholding model that persists to this day. At the same time, the Chinese state's financial support for Huawei intensified rather than diminished. In 1998, the Beijing headquarters of China Construction Bank extended Huawei a buyer's credit line of RMB 3.9 billion, representing an astonishing 45% of CCB Beijing's total credit extension that year. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China followed with a $3.5 billion line in 1999.
These were technically loans to Huawei's customers to finance equipment purchases, but they functioned as a critical export credit subsidy that allowed Huawei to bundle attractive financing with its equipment in a way that Western competitors, dependent on commercial bank financing at market rates, could not easily match. The arrangement would eventually scale into the China Development Bank's $10 billion buyer's credit facility announced in 2004, creating what industry analysts called the iron triangle of Huawei, the customer, and the Chinese state bank. Ren has been characteristically candid about this dependency. If there had been no government policy to protect nationally owned companies, he has said, Huawei would no longer exist. The financial scaffolding that carried Huawei through the late 1990s also included a fundamental restructuring of its employee stock ownership plan. The original 1990 ESOP had been designed primarily as a financing instrument. Shares sold to employees at RMB 10 each raised capital that Huawei, locked out of the state bank system, desperately needed. In 1997, Ren restructured the plan. The share price was cut tenfold, from RMB 10 to RMB 1, and employees were permitted to take bank loans, facilitated by Huawei's own financial union, to fund their purchases. The ESOP was reframed from a capital-raising tool into a performance incentive system, with the number of participating employees growing rapidly. The legal form changed as well. Shares were now held not directly by individual employees, but through Huawei's trade union, a structural choice driven by Shenzhen's 1997 regulations on employee stock ownership, which made the trade union conduit the only available mechanism for concentrated employee ownership in a private Chinese company. For a brief period after 1997, there were two parallel trade unions holding Huawei shares: the Huawei Technologies Corporation Trade Union and the Huawei New Technologies Joint Stock Corporation Trade Union, the latter holding approximately 33% and serving as an investment vehicle for the provincial joint venture shell entities: Shanghai Huawei, Chengdu Huawei, Shenyang Huawei, Anhui Huawei, Sichuan Huawei, and various Mobeco-affiliated entities. In April 2001, under new Shenzhen regulations, both trade unions were converted into trade union committees. At the same time, Huawei introduced its phantom or virtual restricted shares program. New employees would no longer receive registered equity shares, but rather virtual stock options whose value tracked Huawei's net assets per share. By the end of 2001, the virtual share price had risen to RMB 2.64 from a notional RMB 1 baseline. Existing employees were given the option to exchange their old shares for the new instrument. The 2001 to 2003 corporate restructuring then bought out the provincial joint venture shareholders entirely. The shell companies, Mobeco, Shanghai Huawei, Sichuan Huawei, and the rest disappeared. From 2003 forward, Huawei was structured as Shenzhen Huawei Investment and Holding Co., owned 1.42% by Ren personally, and the remainder by the Trade Union Committee on behalf of shareholding employees. This is the architecture that has persisted ever since, and that has generated the ownership controversy, debated by Balding and Clark on one side and Goto and Wang on the other, that continues to dominate Western analysis of who actually controls Huawei. The corporate restructuring of 2001 to 2003 was not merely a legal housekeeping exercise. It was the moment when Huawei's institutional identity crystallized. The company was no longer a collectively owned enterprise with a web of provincial stakeholders who were simultaneously customers, shareholders, and dividend recipients. It was a private company owned by its employees through a centralized mechanism controlled by its founder. The transformation closed the vulnerability that the provincial joint venture structure had always represented, the risk that a disgruntled local partner or a change in provincial political leadership could disrupt the company's operations, while preserving the employee ownership philosophy that Ren viewed as fundamental to Huawei's motivation and retention advantage. The restructuring was undertaken against the backdrop of the most dangerous period Huawei had yet faced. In early 2001, at a meeting of Huawei's executive management team, Ren delivered the speech that has since become the most famous piece of corporate prose in Chinese business history, Huawei's Winter. The essay opened with a question that must have shocked an audience accustomed to triumphal pronouncements. What will we do if one day our company's sales decline, our profits decline, or we even go bankrupt? It went on to argue that Huawei's peacetime had been too long, that too many cadres had been promoted without ever facing genuine crisis, that bonus-enriched employees were buying villas and losing their hunger, and that the company must rehearse defeat now so it could survive it later. The timing was extraordinary. Huawei was reporting 2000 sales of RMB 22 billion and profits of RMB 2.9 billion, ranking first among China's top 100 electronics companies. 15,000 employees were moving into the gleaming new Bantian campus. Bonuses and dividends were at record levels. Ren was warning of catastrophe at the peak of success. He was right. From March 2001, the Nasdaq crash spread to telecommunications equipment with devastating speed. The dot-com bubble, which had inflated Western telecom equipment valuations to historic levels, Nortel briefly accounted for nearly a third of the Toronto Stock Exchange's total market capitalization. Lucent's $284 billion peak briefly made it the world's most valuable company, burst with consequences that reshaped the entire industry. Lucent lost $16.1 billion in 2001 alone, more than its cumulative profits since the 1996 spin-off from AT&T, and another $7 billion in 2002. Its stock fell from $65 in September 1999 to 76 cents in October 2002. Nortel, which had aggressively booked optical equipment revenue during the boom, became embroiled in accounting fraud allegations and lost more than 90% of its market value, eventually filing for bankruptcy in 2009. Ericsson came close to financial collapse and was rescued only by a massive rights issue in 2002. Alcatel hemorrhaged. The industry shed hundreds of thousands of jobs across North America and Europe. Equipment prices fell 50 to 70% as capacity outstripped demand. Huawei did not escape unscathed. For the first time in its history, the company recorded negative revenue growth in 2002, with sales falling from roughly RMB 25.5 billion in 2001 to approximately the same level or slightly lower. But the comparative survival rate was decisive. While Western competitors were forced into emergency cost-cutting, abandoning R&D programs, retreating from emerging markets, and ultimately into the mergers that would produce Alcatel-Lucent in 2006 and Nokia-Siemens Networks in 2007, Huawei, capitalized by its employee stock plan, its state bank credit lines, and a dramatic asset sale, kept its R&D budget intact, kept its international expansion teams in place, and used the downturn to absorb market share that retreating Western vendors were forced to abandon. A companion essay, Northern Country Spring, published in April 2001 and inspired by the melancholy Japanese song Kitaguni no Haru by Masao Sen, drew lessons from Japan's lost decade. Japanese companies, Ren observed, had endured a decade of economic stagnation precisely by maintaining discipline in adversity, by cutting costs without cutting capabilities, by preserving their engineering teams even when revenue fell, and by emerging from the downturn leaner and more competitive. Winter will always pass, he wrote, and spring will surely come, but only for those who build themselves during the cold months. The Huawei's winter speech was, in retrospect, less a prophecy than a deliberate cultural inoculation. By collectively rehearsing the crisis in early 2001, Ren had given the organization permission to make the hard decisions when the crisis actually arrived a few months later. The hardest decision was the Avansys sale. By late 2000, Huawei's balance sheet was under severe strain. The WCDMA third-generation mobile program alone was projected to consume RMB 4 billion over 5 years. International expansion required heavy advance payments and long collection cycles. The employee stock plan's dividend obligations were growing, and Ren had ideologically and strategically rejected the option of an initial public offering, which he believed would subject Huawei to the short-term thinking that was destroying Western telecom companies before his eyes. To raise cash without an IPO, he sold the family silver. In October 2001, Huawei sold its power supply subsidiary, Avansys Power, to Emerson Electric for $750 million in cash. The deal was, at the time, the largest merger and acquisition transaction ever completed between a private Chinese company and a foreign investor.
Avansys had been a high-performing unit, 48 patents, RMB $2.6 billion in 2001 sales, RMB $500 to $600 million in annual profit. It was exactly the kind of business that a conventional corporate strategist would have kept. Ren's official explanation, focus on our core business, was diplomatically true, but understated. The transaction was a strategic divestiture designed to monetize non-core R&D and build the war chest that Huawei needed to survive the winter he had predicted.
The $750 million in cash gave Huawei the financial oxygen to continue investing in WCDMA, optical equipment, and international expansion during the 2 years when its Western competitors were slashing budgets and retreating. Less well known because it did not become public until the Financial Times broke the story in February 2019 was that Huawei came within a signed letter of intent of being acquired by Motorola in 2003. The negotiations were led on the Motorola side by then Chief Operating Officer Mike Zafirovsky, who would later become CEO of Nortel. Ren met Motorola executives in Hainan. A deal was tentatively agreed at a price of US $7.5 billion. The transaction collapsed when Motorola's board, under CEO Ed Zander, who had taken over from Christopher Galvin in early 2004, refused to ratify the price. The historical counterfactual is staggering. Had the deal gone through, Huawei would have become a US-owned division of Motorola. The entire subsequent geopolitical confrontation between Washington and Huawei would not have occurred, and Motorola itself would have inherited the company that would, by 2012, surpass Ericsson to become the world's largest telecommunications equipment supplier. When the deal fell through, Ren reportedly told colleagues that Huawei must now stand alone, a moment that several Huawei executives have described as ideologically formative for the company's later self-reliance doctrine, the spare tire plan philosophy that would carry it through the U.S. sanctions of the 2020s. A particular feature of Huawei's survival during the bust was its avoidance of the information technology and data services bubble that destroyed many of its Chinese peers. While UT Starcom chased the late 1990s Chinese mobile data boom with its PHS Little Smart Wireless Local Loop product, and while many other Chinese technology firms diversified into internet plays that evaporated after 2001, the Basic Law's Article 22, the explicit prohibition on entering information services, kept Huawei strictly within telecom infrastructure. UT Starcom's stock collapsed by more than 90% between 2002 and 2005. Huawei's discipline, enshrined in its corporate constitution 3 years before the bubble burst, looked in retrospect like strategic wisdom. It was, more precisely, strategic self-binding. Ren had tied Huawei to the mast so that it could not hear the sirens. Alongside the financial crises, Ren was dealing with the most painful internal drama of his career. Li Yinan, the boy genius from Huazhong University of Science and Technology, admitted to its juvenile prodigy class at age 15, recruited by Huawei in 1993, promoted to head of the Central Research Department within 6 months, made vice president at 27, and widely whispered inside the company to be Ren's chosen successor, abruptly resigned in late 2000. He took with him a substantial team of R&D and sales colleagues and approximately RMB 10 million in cashed-out dividend stock. In November 2000, he founded Beijing Harbor Networks, initially positioned as a Huawei sales agent in the data networking space, but rapidly evolving into a direct competitor producing routers and Ethernet switches. The reasons for Li's departure have been disputed. Some accounts suggest a strategic disagreement. Li wanted Huawei to push aggressively into IP and data networking, where Cisco was vulnerable, while Ren prioritized continued investment in switching and the new WCDMA program. Others cite a personality clash between two exceptionally strong-willed individuals. Eva Dou's House of Huawei implies that Li had grown uncomfortable with Ren's centralized control. Whatever the cause, Ren took the defection as a personal betrayal. The Huawei versus Harbor war that followed, running from 2000 to 2006, became internal mythology. Ren reportedly ordered the creation of a dedicated anti-harbor task force.
Huawei undercut Harbor on every contract, poached its engineers, allegedly pressured customers not to buy Harbor products, and ultimately filed intellectual property infringement claims against the company in 2005. By 2005, Harbor Networks had grown to roughly $100 million in revenue and approximately 1,500 employees across 28 Chinese cities, a substantial company by any normal standard, but a fraction of Huawei's scale. When the deal fell through, Ren reportedly told colleagues that Huawei must now stand alone, a moment that several Huawei executives have described as ideologically formative for the company's later self-reliance doctrine, the spare tire plan philosophy that would carry it through the U.S. sanctions of the 2020s. A particular feature of Huawei's survival during the bust was its avoidance of the information technology and data services bubble that destroyed many of its Chinese peers. While UT Starcom chased the late 1990s Chinese mobile data boom with its PHS Little Smart Wireless Local Loop product, and while many other Chinese technology firms diversified into internet plays that evaporated after 2001, the Basic Law's Article 22, the explicit prohibition on entering information services, kept Huawei strictly within telecom infrastructure. UT Starcom stock collapsed by more than 90% between 2002 and 2005. Huawei's discipline, enshrined in its corporate constitution 3 years before the bubble burst, looked in retrospect like strategic wisdom. It was, more precisely, strategic self-binding. Ren had tied Huawei to the mast so that it could not hear the sirens.
The Harbor episode confirmed an unwritten rule at Huawei. Those who left did not come back, except as defeated competitors, and the prince who might have been king became instead a cautionary tale about the price of independence. The external crisis that most directly threatened Huawei's international ambitions arrived on January 22, 2003, when Cisco Systems filed suit in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Texas against Huawei Technologies, Huawei America, and FutureWay Technologies. The lawsuit was the first major intellectual property case filed by an American technology giant against a Chinese rival, and its allegations were severe. Cisco claimed that Huawei had copied Cisco's iOS source code into Huawei's own VRP router operating system, including text strings, file names, and, most damningly, bugs that were identical to those found in Cisco's code. Cisco further alleged copying of copyrighted user manuals and help screens, copying of the command line interface, and infringement of multiple patents, most centrally those relating to Cisco's proprietary EIGRP routing protocol. The evidence presented in court filings was substantial and specific. A Huawei engineer had been provided in June 1999 by what Cisco described as a third party not employed by Huawei with a disk containing computer source code related to routers. In July 1999, EIGRP code from that disk had been provided to a Huawei software engineer working on Huawei's own version of the EIGRP protocol for the VRP operating system. Huawei's defense that these were rogue actions by individual engineers rather than a corporate strategy was contested by Cisco but survived legal challenge. The distinction mattered enormously. The difference between corporate-directed espionage and inadequate oversight of individual engineers was the difference between a company that could be trusted as a global vendor and one that could not. The court issued a preliminary injunction on June 7, 2003, ordering Huawei to cease using or selling any operating system derived from Cisco's EIGRP source code, reassign any Huawei engineers who had worked with Cisco code, and submit to a neutral expert's review of its source code. Huawei withdrew the contested Quidway router products from sale in the United States and began rewriting the disputed portions of its VRP operating system. The legal proceedings ran through 2003 in parallel with a development that was both strategically brilliant and transparently motivated by the litigation, the H3C joint venture with 3Com. In March 2003, Huawei and 3Com announced a non-binding letter of intent for a joint venture that would combine Huawei's enterprise networking technology and R&D personnel with 3Com's cash, sales channels, and, crucially, American corporate credibility.
3Com CEO Bruce Claflin submitted a sworn declaration in support of Huawei in the Cisco case, attesting that 3Com's own engineers, given access to Huawei's source code, had found no infringement of Cisco's intellectual property. The H3C joint venture was formally incorporated in November 2003, registered in Hong Kong with operations headquartered in Hangzhou. Huawei contributed technology and roughly 700 R&D staff in exchange for 51% ownership, while 3Com contributed US $165 million in cash, plus its China enterprise business for 49%. The joint venture was simultaneously a litigation shield, a market access strategy for American and European enterprise markets, and a financial vehicle that allowed Huawei to monetize its data networking business while retaining technological control. The H3C structure was cleverly designed to serve different audiences in different markets. Within China, H3C branded products were effectively rebadged Huawei equipment, sold through Huawei's existing carrier and enterprise channels. In Europe and the Americas, the same products were sold under 3Com brand, carrying the credibility and customer relationships of an established American networking company. In Japan, they were distributed through NEC partnership arrangements. The multi-brand architecture allowed Huawei's technology to reach markets where the Huawei name was either unknown or suspect, while 3Com gained access to a world-class R&D engine at a fraction of the cost of building one internally. Over the next 3 years, H3C grew at compound annual rates above 60%, generating roughly $685 million in revenue by 2005. In 2005, Huawei transferred 2% of the JV to 3Com, raising 3Com's stake to 51%. In 2006, Huawei sold its remaining 49% to 3Com for $882 million, a return that more than vindicated the original investment and helped fund Huawei's 3G expansion.
When Bain Capital and Huawei attempted to reacquire 3Com itself in 2007, the deal was blocked on U.S. national security grounds by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, a foreshadowing of the regulatory confrontations that would define the 2010s and 2020s. Hewlett-Packard eventually acquired 3Com in 2010 for $2.7 billion, with H3C continuing as a sub-brand that was later majority acquired by Tsinghua Unigroup in 2016. The original 2003 H3C deal thus served all of its 2003 purposes: Cisco settlement, enterprise market access, cash monetization, and also provided Huawei with its first sustained exposure to the cross-border M&A scrutiny that would later define its relationship with the United States. On October 1, 2003, Cisco and Huawei announced a stay in the lawsuits pending the neutral expert's review of Huawei's modified products. On July 28, 2004, the case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning Cisco could not refile substantially similar claims. The settlement required Huawei to modify its command line interface, user manuals, help screens, and portions of its source code. Financial terms were confidential and have never been disclosed. The aftermath of the Cisco settlement has remained contested ever since. Huawei's chief U.S. representative, Charles Ding, claimed in 2012 that Huawei had been vindicated because no infringement had been found. Cisco's general counsel, Mark Chandler, responded by breaking what he described as a mutual confidentiality expectation, posting a detailed public statement alleging that Cisco had documented direct verbatim copying of its source code, command line interface, help screens, and copyrighted manuals. The two corporate narratives cannot be reconciled, and the confidential settlement means neither side's account can be definitively verified. What can be said is that the Cisco lawsuit had two lasting effects on Huawei. First, it dramatically improved the company's internal intellectual property management discipline. Huawei established formal patent licensing offices, signed its first patent cross-license agreement with Ericsson in 2002, and began the systematic patent portfolio build that would, by 2008, make it the world's top patent applicant under the Patent Cooperation Treaty.
Second, it permanently shaped Huawei's reputation in the United States. Every subsequent U.S. national security narrative about Huawei, from the 2012 House Intelligence Committee report through the 2019 Entity List sanctions, reaches back to the Cisco precedent as a foundational data point. Beneath the corporate crises and legal battles, the product diversification that would define Huawei's next decade was advancing on every front. The C&C08 switch remained the revenue backbone, but by the late 1990s, Huawei's R&D organization, now being systematically reorganized under the IBM IPD framework, was expanding into multiple adjacent product categories simultaneously. In wireless, Huawei launched its first GSM mobile network products in 1997, followed by CDMA capability in both the CDMA 450 and CDMA 2000 variants. The strategic decision to develop CDMA 450, a niche standard that European and American vendors had largely abandoned, gave Huawei a near monopoly position in the CDMA 450 reference markets that dotted Africa, Southeast Asia, and Russia. It was classic Huawei positioning. Find the product category that the big players consider too small or too peripheral to contest, dominate it completely, and use it as a beachhead for broader market penetration. The most consequential product bet of the period was the WCDMA third-generation mobile program, which Huawei launched in 1998. The decision to align with the European 3GPP standard rather than the American-led CDMA 2000 camp was itself a strategic calculation. Vodafone, Telefonica, France Telecom, T-Mobile, and the other European multinationals that dominated GSM in globally accessible markets were all committed to the WCDMA upgrade path. By targeting WCDMA, Huawei positioned itself to serve the carriers that controlled the largest and most lucrative wireless networks outside the United States. The initial program was budgeted to 200 R&D staff for 3 years. By 2003, it had scaled to roughly 3,500 R&D staff and consumed approximately RMB 4 billion, roughly USD 483 million, in cumulative investment. China's regulatory delay of third-generation licensing, the State Council postponed the issuance of 3G licenses through the mid-2000s while it nurtured the domestic TD-CDMA standard, meant that Huawei's WCDMA equipment was deployed internationally before it could be deployed at home, creating a forcing function for the internationalization that REN was already pursuing. By 2004, Huawei was involved in 14 of the 19 commercial 3G network buildouts worldwide. In optical transmission, Huawei launched its optics SDH products line in the late 1990s and entered the German market with an SDH sale in 2001. The optics platform, later expanded to include dense wavelength division multiplexing capability, became one of Huawei's most consistently successful product lines and a critical revenue contributor during the transition from voice-centric to data-centric networks. In data networking, the Quidway router and switch family, developed in Huawei's Beijing Data Communications Research Center, which had been established in 1995, was the products that brought Huawei into direct collision with Cisco and ultimately triggered the 2003 lawsuit. The Quidway line was intended as a full-range alternative to Cisco's dominant enterprise routers and switches, and by 2003, it was deployed across China and being introduced into Russian and developing country markets. The H3C joint venture, whatever its litigation defense function, also served to validate Huawei's data networking technology through 3Com's endorsement, and H3C's subsequent growth to roughly $685 million in revenue by 2005 would prove that the products themselves were commercially competitive. In access networking, Huawei developed DSLM and multi-service access node products that positioned it for the broadband build-out that would dominate the mid-2000s as fixed-line operators upgraded their last-mile copper infrastructure to carry broadband internet traffic. And in July 2003, Huawei formally established its handset department, the organizational seed of what would eventually become the Consumer Business Group and one of the world's largest smartphone makers. The first phone, the C300, shipped in 2004. The U626, Huawei's first 3G handset, launched in June 2005. In 2003, the handset business was an experimental side bet that few inside or outside the company took seriously. It would prove to be one of the most consequential product decisions in technology history. The R&D infrastructure supporting this diversification extended well beyond Shenzhen. In 1999, Huawei established its first overseas R&D center in Bangalore, India, leveraging the Indian software talent pool and the capability maturity model process discipline that Indian IT firms had pioneered. The Bangalore Center achieved CMM Level 4 accreditation in 2001 and CMM Level 5, then rare even among established global software companies, in 2003. A Stockholm R&D center opened in 2000, deliberately located to tap the engineering talent pool clustered around Ericsson's headquarters. By 2001, Huawei had set up 4 R&D centers in the United States, most notably in Plano and Dallas, Texas, and in Silicon Valley. In 2001, Huawei joined the International Telecommunication Union as a sector member, marking its formal entry into the international standards community that would increasingly shape the competitive landscape through the 3G and 4G eras. The organizational transformations of 1997 to 2003 extended beyond the IBM engagement to the governance structure at the top of the company. In 1999, Sun Yafang was appointed chairwoman of Huawei's board, a position she would hold for 19 years until her retirement in March 2018. Sun's appointment formalized the division of labor that had been emerging informally. She would manage Huawei's relationship with the Chinese state and oversee the institutional transformation, while Ren focused on management philosophy, strategic direction, and the company's expanding international profile. Sun also took on the chairmanship of the Business Transformation Executive Steering Committee, making her the executive sponsor of the entire IBM-led overhaul, a role that placed her at the operational center of the company's most important management initiative. Her appointment as chairwoman was, in effect, Ren's acknowledgement that Huawei had outgrown the founder-as-everything model and needed a collective leadership structure. The management restructuring of 2003 distributed power further. Ren remained president, but the executive management team, comprising senior vice presidents including Guo Ping, Eric X, Ken Hu, Sun Yafang, Ren Shulu, and others, collectively ran day-to-day operations. This was the early move toward the rotating CEO system that would be formalized in 2011, and that represents perhaps Huawei's most distinctive governance innovation, a leadership structure designed to prevent the concentration of power in any single individual, including the founder. The period from 1997 to 2003 was also extraordinarily productive for Ren as a writer and public intellectual, a dimension of his leadership that has no real parallel in Western corporate history. Through Huawei's internal newspaper, Huawei People, and the Xinsheng Community Online Forum, Ren produced a body of long-form essays that functioned simultaneously as management directives, philosophical reflections, and cultural artifacts. The most important works of the period included Huawei's Winter and Northern Country Spring, already discussed, and 2 additional pieces that deserve attention.
How Long Can Huawei Survive, published in 1998, was the foundational essay on existential corporate anxiety, arguing that in the information and communications industry, there were only two possible positions, taking the lead or getting wiped out, with no middle ground for comfortable mediocrity. The essay established the intellectual framework that would later justify the IBM engagement, the WCDMA investment, and the aggressive international expansion. If the only alternative to global leadership was extinction, then the costs of transformation, however painful, were less than the cost of standing still. My Father and Mother, published on February 8, 2001, was a remarkable autobiographical essay written in the immediate aftermath of his mother's death in a traffic accident in Kunming. The essay, subsequently translated into English by Ziqian Wang on the Pekingnology newsletter, recounted Ren's childhood in Guizhou poverty, his father's persecution during the Cultural Revolution, and his own coming of age in circumstances of extreme material and political deprivation. It revealed a more vulnerable, family-driven figure than Ren's public persona as the relentless wolf culture chieftain would suggest. It also revealed the depth of his complicated loyalty to the Communist Party that had, in his own telling, persecuted his father while simultaneously providing the institutional framework within which Ren himself had risen. The essay was circulated to all Huawei employees and became part of the company's cultural canon, a deliberate demonstration by the founder that personal suffering and institutional loyalty could coexist, and that hardship was not something to be avoided, but something to be survived and transcended. Read together, Ren's writings from 1997 to 2003 form a coherent intellectual project, the construction of a private corporate canon that articulated the values, fears, ambitions, and emotional register of the company in a way that no Western corporation has attempted, let alone achieved. Where Western CEOs write the obligatory annual report letter, and if they are unusually thoughtful, an occasional memoir, Ren wrote, and continues to write, the equivalent of a Confucian scholar's collected works, a body of texts intended to be studied, debated, and internalized by generations of employees. By the end of 2003, the numbers told the story of the transformation. Revenue had grown from RMB 4.1 billion in 1997 to roughly RMB 31.7 billion, approximately US dollars 3.8 billion in 2003, a nearly eightfold increase in 7 years that included the first revenue decline in company history during the 2002 telecom bust. The employee count had grown from about 5,600 to roughly 22,000. International revenue had risen from near zero to approximately $1.05 billion, about 27% of total sales. R&D centers operated in Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, Bangalore, Stockholm, and 4 U.S. cities. The product portfolio had expanded from a single product line, the C&C08 switch, to encompass GSM and CDMA wireless infrastructure, WCDMA third-generation mobile equipment, SDH and DWDM optical transmission, enterprise routers and switches, broadband access equipment, and a nascent handset business. Huawei had signed its first European carrier contracts, established a beachhead in 45 countries, survived the global telecom bust that had destroyed or crippled every major Western competitor, absorbed a lawsuit from the world's most powerful networking company, and built, through the IBM engagement and its supporting consultancies, a management infrastructure capable of operating at global scale. The company that emerged from the 1997 to 2003 period was, in almost every structural respect, a different entity from the one that had entered it. The mattress culture was giving way, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, to the IPD process discipline that IBM had installed. The founder-as-everything model was yielding to collective leadership. The provincial JV financing model had been replaced by state bank credit, employee stock ownership, and retained earnings. The rural-encirclement strategy had been extended from China's countryside to the developing world's countryside and was beginning to probe the urban markets of Europe. And the wolf culture, while still present in Huawei's sales operations and self-image, was being complemented by an institutional discipline that wolves, left to their own instincts, would never have developed. The broader global context of 1997 to 2003 reshaped the competitive landscape in ways that systematically favored Huawei's position. China's accession to the World Trade Organization on December 11, 2001, was for Huawei a paradoxical event.
Beijing's Huawei commitments nominally opened the Chinese basic telecommunication services market to up to 49% foreign investment and the value-added market to 50%.
In practice, as scholars including Francois Lamon have documented, the Chinese government continued to direct domestic carriers' procurement toward national champion vendors, and foreign firms' share of the Chinese equipment market continued to decline through the 2000s. WTO membership thus opened Huawei's overseas markets by legitimizing Chinese companies as trade partners and by providing recourse to WTO dispute resolution mechanisms, without meaningfully opening Huawei's home market to foreign competition. This asymmetry was exactly what Western competitors had feared during the accession negotiations, and it became one of the structural advantages that powered Huawei's rise. The 3G standards war added another dimension of strategic complexity. 3 competing third-generation mobile standards had been approved by the International Telecommunication Union: WCDMA, championed by European vendors and operators; CDMA 2000, championed by Qualcomm and American carriers; and TD-CDMA, developed by China's Datong Telecom and championed by Beijing as a matter of national technological sovereignty. In May 2000, the ITU formally approved TD-CDMA as one of 3 global 3G standards. In October 2002, China's Ministry of Information Industry allocated 155 megahertz of spectrum to TD-CDMA versus only 60 megahertz each to WCDMA and CDMA 2000, signaling Beijing's strong policy preference for the homegrown standard. But China then delayed the issuance of 3G licenses. They would not be granted until January 2009, while TD-CDMA technology matured. The delay created an unusual strategic situation. Huawei's WCDMA equipment, developed at enormous cost for the 3GPP standard, could not be deployed in China's own market, but could be sold to European and Asian operators who were moving ahead with 3G rollouts. International markets thus became not merely a growth opportunity, but the only available proving ground for Huawei's most important next-generation product. The combination of being locked out of the domestic 3G market while maintaining the world's most aggressive WCDMA R&D program created a powerful forced internationalization. Huawei had to go global because staying domestic only would have meant developing a product it could not sell. The Western telecom equipment industry, meanwhile, was in ruins. Lucent would merge with Alcatel in 2006. Nortel would declare bankruptcy in 2009. Siemens would fold its telecom equipment business into a joint venture with Nokia in 2007. Motorola would split into 2 companies in 2011, with its network equipment business eventually being absorbed by Nokia. Of the 7 major Western telecom equipment vendors that had dominated the industry in 1997, Lucent, Nortel, Ericsson, Alcatel, Siemens, Motorola, and Nokia, only Ericsson and Nokia would survive the next decade as independent telecom infrastructure companies, and both would do so at substantially reduced scale. Into the competitive vacuum created by this consolidation, Huawei, and to a lesser extent ZTE, would advance with the speed and certainty of water filling a depression. The comparison with ZTE is instructive and important. ZTE, founded in Shenzhen in 1985, just 2 years before Huawei, had followed a remarkably similar trajectory through the 1990s, from consumer electronics trading to PBX manufacturing to digital switches, with a rural-first sales strategy and aggressive pricing in developing markets. ZTE listed on the Shenzhen Stock Exchange in 1997, giving it access to public equity capital that Huawei, deliberately private, did not have. Both companies expanded internationally during the same window, both moved into Europe, and both challenged Cisco, Lucent, Nortel, Ericsson, and Nokia. But by the early 2000s, the strategic divergence was becoming visible. Huawei's IBM process investment gave it an organizational depth that ZTE never matched. Huawei's ESOP created a different kind of employee commitment than ZTE's public company stock options.
and Huawei's Basic Law gave it a strategic self-discipline, exemplified by Article 22's renunciation of information services that ZTE, under different governance pressures, did not always maintain. The consequences of this divergence would play out dramatically in the 2010s, when ZTE's less disciplined compliance with U.S. export controls would lead to the Iran sanctions violations that nearly destroyed the company in 2018. Huawei's own confrontation with the U.S. government would come from a fundamentally different direction, not from sanctions evasion, but from the sheer scale and strategic significance of a Chinese company that had become too successful to ignore. It is tempting, from the vantage point of the 2020s, to read the 1997 to 2003 period as an inevitable march toward global dominance. It was nothing of the sort. At multiple points during these 7 years, Huawei came within striking distance of failure, acquisition, or irrelevance.
The 1998 Russian crisis could have killed the international expansion before it began. The 2001 to 2002 revenue contraction could have forced the kind of R&D cuts that destroyed Western competitors' ability to compete in the next cycle. The Motorola acquisition, had it closed, would have absorbed Huawei into a company that itself was only a decade from dismemberment. The Cisco lawsuit could have branded Huawei as a technology thief and locked it out of developed markets permanently. Li Yinan's defection could have fractured the R&D organization at the worst possible moment. Any one of these events, playing out slightly differently, would have produced a radically different outcome. What prevented that outcome was not luck, but structure. The structure that the Basic Law, the IBM transformation, the ESOP, the state bank credit lines, and Ren's own institutional paranoia had collectively built. Huawei survived because it had, between 1997 and 2003, created an organization that could absorb shocks, maintain investment through downturns, attract and retain talent without an IPO, and learn from Western competitors without becoming dependent on Western goodwill. The management processes were IBM's, the financial architecture was distinctively Chinese, the strategic vision was Ren Zhangfei's, and the execution was the product of 22,000 employees who had literally bought into the company's future with their own savings. The next chapter of Huawei's history, the 2004 to 2012 period, in which the company would surpass Ericsson, build the world's most extensive 4G base station portfolio, enter the smartphone market, and provoke the national security confrontation with the United States that continues to this day, would be built entirely on the foundation laid during these 7 transformative years. The IBM consultants had taught Huawei how to manage. The Basic Law had told it what to believe. Huawei's winter had taught it how to endure. And the Cisco lawsuit had taught it, in the hardest possible way, that the world beyond China's borders played by rules that Huawei could not afford to ignore. Everything that followed, every 4G base station deployed in Africa, every smartphone sold in Europe, every Mate 60 Pro chip secretly fabricated in defiance of American sanctions, traces its lineage back to the winter of 2001, the IBM templates of 1998, and the 6 Renmin University professors who spent 3 years asking Ren Zhangfei what his company actually believed.